Welcome back, everyone. The afternoon session of our webinar episode commences now. For our next research speaker, we are welcoming back Ms. Desiree Benipayo from the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation. Ms. Desiree Ann Pua Benipayo is a fervent advocate of Philippine history. World War II history holds a special place in her heart, and it is from this intense interest that she wrote the book Honor, the Legacy of Jose Abad Santos, about our late Chief Justice, whom she considers as one of the greatest Filipino heroes of World War II. Honor was awarded Best Book of Nonfiction Prose in English in the recently concluded 2019 National Book Awards. She and her husband produced the movie version of the book, also entitled Honor. The film has garnered several recognitions in film fest here and abroad, and has been given the highest rating of A by the Philippine Cinema Evaluation Board. It has since been shown at many institutions and schools here and abroad. Des Benipayo is currently the Vice President for Research and Education of the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, which aims to initiate, develop, and carry out projects and activities that will enlighten the Filipino people, especially the youth, about the World War II history via multimedia platforms. She is also the Secretary of Memorare Manila 1945, an organization which aims to preserve the history of the Battle of Manila and commemorate the memory of more than 100,000 who died during the battle. She also serves as the local tour manager of the National World War II Museum based in New Orleans for their World War II in the Pacific Victory Tours. Aside from indulging her love for history, Des manages several companies and raises 4 children with her husband. Once again, to present her lecture live about the women of the Philippine resistance, here is Ms. Desiree Benipayo.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, sir.
Oh, good. Hi. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Magandang tanghali po. Baka yung iba sa atin nagla-lunch break pa. Di bali po, masaya yung kwentuhang to tungkol sa mga magigiting nating mga kababaihan nung World War II. This will be the topic also of my next book, hopefully to be out soon. Ang hirap mag-research ngayon kasi yung mga libraries sarado, so it's really challenging, no, for researchers nowadays. So I'd like to present to you these very intrepid women who really helped further the cause of the war during World War II. No? So let me share my screen. Hold on. Can you see it? Teka, natatakpan na. Wait. No, hindi ko maayos. Ayan. Okay. Hold on. Hindi ko maayos yung dahil... Can you see it? The screen now? Visible
Yes,
ba? Alright, sige. The black thing is on top of my computer. I can't do the slide share tuloy. Anyway, hope you can bear with me with this small is it okay? Natatakpan kasi nitong black na to eh. Hold on Wait, let me see. Hindi ko siya ma-access. Anyway, sige, I'll just continue with this. I hope you can see it all, no? All right. So let me begin my lecture. Historians have estimated that 1 in every 10 Filipino guerrillas during World War II was female. They came from all social classes and backgrounds and served the gamut of roles as nurses and medics, field commanders, soldiers, spies, saboteurs, recruiters, and propagandists. Like their male counterparts, these Filipino resistance fighters took on their ordeals of war, risking life and limb for the love of country. But for all their courage, wit, and resourcefulness, women's role in the resistance gets far less attention than it should get. Except for a few memoirs written by Except for a few memoirs written by women, there is a lack of literature available on the vital roles women played during the war. There is a need to fill this void and reinforce the importance of women's substantial participation in resistance activities that helped in the overall war effort. This paper examines the wartime exploits of some of these intrepid women, ranging from soliciting aid to clandestine underground work to saving downed pilots, breaking gender stereotypes and proving their mettle. By early 1942, after the fall of Bataan, many guerrilla groups had sprouted all over the country. Women also heeded the call to defend their country from the invading Imperial Japanese forces. The rise and success of these guerrilla groups in part is attributable to the women in the group who served vital roles as nurses, organizers, intelligence, and commanders in the battlefield. In this section, I will discuss with you some important and major guerrilla groups and the women who helped run these groups. Okay, so we'll first discuss Tita Sophie, Sofia Gatil Tidon. She's still alive, well and alive and living in Los Baños. No? She's already 95 years old, turning 96 this year. So in 1943, Tita Sophie was 16 years old and she was recruited into the PQOG, or President Quezon's own group. She held the rank of Private First Class and she was in the 25th Red Lions Combat Division and she was based in Los Baños, Laguna. She did surveillance, propaganda, recruitment work for the unit and tended to her wounded and sick comrades. During daytime, she helped her mother tend their small stores. So dun sa palengke doon, meron silang parang tindahan mga parang kakanin and native snacks. So she made that her parang meeting point. So dun pinapadala yung mga messages that she brings to the guerrillas. No? Parang naging ano tuloy siya, parang naging center ng mga guerrilla at that time, yung kanilang maliit na tindahan sa palengke. So Sofia and her colleagues also smuggled in food to the Allied internists at the Los Baños internment camp, which was run by this man, very sadistic, Lieutenant Konishi Sadaaki. So they were continuing, ang kwento sa akin, Tito Sophie, lumulusot daw sila doon sa mga sawali wall, naglagay silang butas, lumulusot sila doon, and then they'd give cassava, whatever they have to the Allied internists there who were really suffering and who were really starving. But then one day she got caught. So she was subjected to the water torture and beaten by the Japanese. To this day, 95-year-old Tidon feels her chest tighten and her heart pound whenever she remembers the harrowing torture inflicted on her. In October 1944, the PQOG guerrillas rescued a downed American pilot by the name of Lieutenant William Foy. So Foy's plane was shot down by anti-Japanese air missiles, and then Foy luckily was able to bolt out of his plane, and he fell somewhere in the Los Baños area. So Sofia and her colleagues took care of Foy, who was badly wounded with a broken neck and damaged spine. Now known to have survived the crash, the Japanese hunted Foy, and the guerrillas had to hide him from one place to another. People suspected of harboring the American were arrested, tortured, and executed. In February 1945, the Japanese escalated their patrols and mercilessly slaughtered many residents in Sofia's town. Among those killed were Sofia's mother and 3 younger siblings. So ang nabuhay na lang siya at saka yung father niya, no? Her mother and her other siblings were part of the massacre done by the Japanese. It is almost impossible to imagine how a young girl of 16, tortured by the enemy, and whose family and townmates had been massacred by the enemy, was able to move on. Sofia herself said, "I am stronger than my misfortunes." In 2018, she was awarded the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal, and with her in the picture is Richard Foy, son of Lieutenant William Foy, who Sofia rescued and took care of in 1945. Richard wrote the book Foy and the Filipinos, which details the heroism, courage, loyalty, and kindness of the Filipinos. Richard emphasized in his book that the Filipinos perform these acts of kindness and humanity despite great risks to their lives. Our next lady, intrepid lady, is Yai Panlilio, or otherwise known as Valeria Yai Panlilio, and she was part of Marking's guerrillas. So Yai was a smart, feisty, and headstrong, half American, half Filipina reporter before the war. No? She was one of the best-known female reporters and writers pre-war, and she was also a broadcaster for KZRH. So KZRH is the mother of our now still running DZRH. No? Before the war, it was named KZRH. So during the occupation, when the Japanese seized KZRH, they got Yai to broadcast the news in English. Siyempre, hindi naman marunong mag-English yung mga Hapon. So they took her and siya yung magbo-broadcast sa English. So in between this news broadcasts, which were all Japanese censored, bago binigay sa kanya yung papel, na censor na ng mga Japanese yon. So in between these broadcasts, Yai would subtly include messages, clues, and innuendos, giving key information to the Philippine-American troops fighting in Bataan. So she was hoping against all odds that she would be able to give important intel. Iniipit niya dun sa mga news broadcast niya. And one day, her boss, which was her longtime boss, Carlos Romulo, na-pick up ni Romulo yun. Sabi niya, nung una nagagalit sila kay Yai, kasi parang, bakit ito sumama, broadcasting for the Japanese? But then one day, Romulo was able to pick up na, oh my, si Yai pala nag-iipit ng mga intel, important intel, who's coming in, ilang ships, mga ganyan. So, doon nila nalaman na yun nga, Yai was giving intel. So that was very dangerous, no? And not only to the Philippine-American troops, but Yai was also broadcasting for to the Manileños, to the Filipinos, and warning them of things to come. So when the Japanese found out, they ordered her arrest. With the help of friends, she went into hiding in a farm east of Manila, where she met the guerrillas of Marking, headed by Marcos Marking Agustin. So Marking was a truck driver and mechanic before the war. So he formed his group, Marking's guerrillas, very early on in 1942. And his guerrilla group grew to 20,000 strong by 1944, and is one of the major guerrilla groups in the country. She joined the group and became Marking's right hand, advising him on many important matters. Fondly called Mammy by the boys, she ran the camp and nursed the sick and the wounded. She handled documentation and paperwork, made reports and propaganda materials, and wrote letters to rich, influential friends for support. In 1950, she wrote her autobiography, The Crucible, which recounts her life as a guerrilla in the rugged mountain fastnesses of the Sierra Madres. The book, for one, is a landmark in literary history, for it was the first Filipino-authored book published by a big U.S. publisher. In the book, Yai emphasizes her biracial traits, her American upbringing being the source of her principles of democracy and fairness, and her belief that women are equal to men, and her Filipino blood as the source of her passion and devotion to the cause. She wrote, Filipinos will die for love, and Americans will die for principle. I am half and half. I die the same way. Most importantly, she wrote the book to publicize the important and unrecognized contributions of the Filipino guerrillas and to recognize the role of the women in the resistance. After the war, Yai and Marking were married and spent much of the post-war years working for the recognition of Filipino guerrillas. In 1950, this iconic female guerrilla received her Medal of Freedom from the US government for her work during the war. So our next group of women, tribute naman to sa mga ating mga resistance, women in the resistance in showbiz, no? Showbiz muna tayo ngayon. Tama-tama tanghaling tapat para magising-gising tayo. Alright, so one of the more famous guerrillera na akala natin movie lang niya pinoportray, but she was really a guerrilla in real life. So was Carmen Rosales. So everybody knows Carmen Rosales, lalo na tayong mga mahilig manood ng mga lumang Tagalog movies. I loved watching old Tagalog movies when I was young. Alright, her real name is Januaria Constantino Keller. She was also half American. So she was the queen of Philippine cinema during the golden years of Philippine cinema in the 1930s and 1940s. And no other star reigned supreme but Carmen Rosales. When the Japanese came in December 1941, in fact, the movie being shown on many theaters was Lolita, which was a Carmen Rosales movie. So during the Japanese occupation, Carmen's husband, Ramon, involved in some underground activities, died tragically in the hands of the Japanese. After Ramon's death, Carmen continued his fight. She joined the guerrilla group Hukbalahap. For a few years, Carmen went to the hills, shed her career as an actress, and toted a .45 caliber gun around the countryside south of Manila. A sharpshooter, she disguised herself as a man and put on a fake mustache so that they could go on missions. In one of these missions, Carmen killed a well-known Japanese collaborator in that area. She was forced to flee to the next province to evade Japanese capture, but eventually she was found and arrested. As punishment, she was forced by the Japanese to star in a Japanese propaganda film, Tres Marias. She had no choice but to agree when the Japanese threatened to kill the residents of her hometown. After the war, her townmates honored her for saving them by naming their town Carmen. After the war, she starred in two war movies, Guerrillera and Kaaway ng Bayan. Guerrillera's storyline was based partly on her wartime exploits. These two post-war movies propelled her to such fame that she became the highest-paid movie actress of her time. So people say she portrayed it very, very realistically. No, maybe not a lot of them didn't know that she really spent time hiding in the hills, being a guerrilla, no, and fighting the enemy. So next, I would just like to discuss about a little bit about vaudeville. Yan yung ating local form of the vaudeville, no, which was made popular in the early American period. So during the war, when the Japanese censored mga American movies para to remove all American, all vestiges of American rule, so yung naging source of entertainment ng mga tao ay itong vaudeville. So many of the theaters then, which were closed because no more movies, became vaudeville theaters. And very interestingly, itong vaudeville is a hodgepodge of skits, music, a song and dances, parang variety show siya, ganyan. And yung mga skits niya were in fact parody of what was happening during the time, no? So parang ito yung pulse ng tao noon. So they would have skits like ang pagbabalik ni Arturo, the return of Arturo, which alluded to MacArthur's I Shall Return. And one time, the very famous, sana ba to, si Tugo and Pugo, no, very famous duo, did a parody ng isang Japanese soldier marching, walking down the street with a lot of wristwatches. So ganun yung mga Hapon nun, di ba? So nagalit yung Hapon, they were picked up and arrested and probably, we don't know, tortured. And then Tugo was asked to change his name because it was very close to the name of General Hideki Tojo, who was in fact also kalbo. So pinapalitan siya ng pangalan. Actually from Togo naging Tugo. And many guerrillas would come and watch the show, no, as R&R. And many underground women of the underground were actresses in vaudevilles. So when the Japanese came, so minsan may palabas sila and then the Kempei Tai would come. Meron na silang clue. So the cast, let's say there's a dance number. So the cast will perform this song and dance number, parang clue for the guerrillas and the resistance fighters then to flee the theater kasi nandiyan na yung mga Kempei Tai. So talagang may sila, may tulungan. So this is really a very interesting part of the showbiz world during that time. Hindi lang sila nag-entertain but meron ding anong tawag dito, may resistance activities din sila. All right, next section is a discussion of the women or angels of the underground. That's what I call them because they were really angels of the underground. They were remarkable for soliciting aid, bringing food and supplies to guerrillas in internment camps, and thus helped save the lives of many. But the other side to this aid giving is their dangerous underground work of gathering intel, smuggling letters and messages, quinine, and other contrabands, which, when found out, will surely mean death. This takes courage, and these women have it. Let's start with Miss Lulu Reyes. So Lourdes Lulu Reyes' life was radically changed that fateful day of April 9, 1942. Hearing news of Bataan's surrender, her mother fell to the ground and wept for her son, Willie, who was fighting in Bataan. Lulu promised her widowed mother that she will find her brother. As the president of the Chaplains Aid Association, she assisted priests who said mass and gave communion at the concentration camp. This way, she was able to find her brother. But finding her brother wasn't enough for this lady with a big heart. Father Forbes Moynihan, an Irish Jesuit, wrote in his book, Under the Red Sun, after the fall of Bataan, Lulu went to Tarlac with her mother to bring help to her brother Willie, who was a prisoner. Seeing the misery of other POWs, she devoted herself to aiding them. Though it was forbidden to enter the prison camp, Lulu went to the Japanese commandant and got his permission to bring in medicines and food. She smuggled money and notes, even if she was warned death was the penalty for doing so. So tigas ulo ni Tita Lulu, kahit na bawal, no, she would bring in messages and other contrabands like quinine and money, which was not allowed by the Japanese then. At the end of the war, Lulu Reyes was awarded the U.S. Medal of Freedom for heroic efforts to aid American POWs. But I have a nice story. Her heroism did not end during the war. She was really, I call her the lady with the big heart. On Christmas of 1945, just after the war, maybe the dust of war haven't even settled yet. So she had the little money, which she was able to earn. And she was Christmas shopping for her family. Pumunta siya sa eskolta. So, nagtitingin-tingin siya, nag-window shop siya, budgeting her money, ano bang ireregalo sa nanay niya, sa kapatid niya. When she saw this widow with so many children who were apparently, having a hard time and gutom yung mga bata. So, instead of shopping, she gave her 50 pesos, her only money. She gave it to the widow. And nagulat yung widow and endlessly thanking her for it. So, nakalimutan niya yung episode na yan, hindi niya na naalala. And years after, she read an article in the Philippine Star written by the editor Max Sullivan when Tita Lulu was still alive, talking about how Max Sullivan had this most wonderful Christmas ever in 1945 when a lady named Lulu Reyes gave them money so they can buy food and clothing for their Christmas since yung mom niya was a widow. So yun pala, yung binigyan niya ng money was Max Sullivan's mother, Pelagia Sullivan. Little did she know, she was just really helping. Hindi naman na hinahanap yung recognition na yon, but she was really a lady with a big heart. So after the war, Lulu got married, raised a family, and continued with her religious and charitable works, earning her the Papal Award in 1981 for her admirable service to her fellow men. The next important lady of the underground is Josefa Llanes Escoda. While the infamous Bataan Death March was still halfway to its destination, Josefa and her husband Tony and a group of doctors went to San Fernando train station to give medical aid to the captured Filipino and American troops. Hiding from the Japanese guards, she secretly took down names, addresses, and messages from the POWs. Upon their return to Manila, she mobilized the members of the National Federation of Women's Clubs, of which she was the president, and set them off to bring messages to the families of the soldiers. On seeing the horrors of the march, Tony and Josefa tapped on different groups and people to solicit aid for the POWs. Josefa was well known as she was a leading civic and social figure of her time and was active in many charitable and social work. She founded the Girl Scouts of the Philippines and was one of the main figures in the Philippines suffrage movement. They tapped on the different women's and civic groups, and almost immediately, a group was formed, Volunteers Social Aid Committee, or VSAC. The group brought food, supplies, and clothing to the POW camps and did much underground work. To raise funds, they organized several benefit shows at the Metropolitan Theater, unbeknownst to the Japanese officers attending these shows. So nabebentahan pa nila ng ticket yung mga Japanese officers without them knowing na yung money will go to aid the POWs, no? And the VSAC ladies were also very charming and were able to convince the Japanese officials for them to do their humanitarian work. So what they would do is they would soften. Ayoko gamitin yung word na bribe. They would soften the Japanese officials with fried chicken dinners, which apparently were the favorite of the Japanese officials. So pag busog na yung mga officers, they would charm their way to saying na, oh, I hope we can continue our humanitarian work and continue with our aid to the POWs. So of course, yes, they were allowed, and it was actually a front for them to continue their underground work of sending letters and money to the prisoners, and getting information also from the prisoners to bring to their families. Kasi marami noon after the death march, the families, especially the ones in the provinces, didn't even know if their sons or their brothers were alive, no? So this was one of the most important work of Josefa Llanes Escoda. Dahil sa mga nakuha niyang messages, names, addresses, which she secretly took down, and also with the VSAC ladies, so they were able to let the families know that either sadly their son has passed away or they're still alive in Capas. So napaka-importante no, especially for families who did not even have means to go to Capas to check on their sons and brothers. So Escoda continued her underground work. And by early 1944, word reached them that they were being watched by Japanese spies. But this didn't stop the couple from doing their underground work. Tony Escoda was captured in June 1944. Then the Japanese came for Josefa 2 months later. Her children remember the day she was arrested. Standing just a little over 4 feet tall, she was flanked by several armed Japanese and taken away. The humanitarian that she was, her daughter Teresita remembered her mother's words. If the roles were reversed and if it were the Japanese who were prisoners of war, I would have done the same. And this was a letter she sent to her cousin, Lieutenant Jose Llanes, which is very, for me, very poignant. No? So she said, I have done my duty to my country and God. To my mind, the best I have done is having helped with the little I could to save the lives of the surrendered soldiers of Bataan and Corregidor. I have offered myself as a guarantor for men, later released by the enemy, that they commit no anti-Japanese act. Men who, if they had the guts left, would continue their resistance. I have acted as guarantor not only for the sake of humanity, but also to encourage them to fight again. If we happen to survive and I fail, tell our people that the women of the Philippines did their part in making the ember sparks of truth and liberty alive until the last moment. So this was a very ominous letter that she wrote to her cousin. Yung guarantor na yan, maybe some of you don't know, no, but yung guarantor na yan, so when the Americans were not allowed to leave Capas, no. So but when the Filipinos were slowly being allowed to be released to their families, so they wrote a guarantee letter or a certification that they will not fight, that they will not join the resistance. But of course, a lot of them did. So they had to have a guarantor. So a lot of them tinulungan ni Josefa. Siya yung naging guarantor because Josefa was at that time a leading social and civic figure. No, kilalang kilala siya. And being a woman, the Japanese were were more trusting of the women at the time. Mas hindi sila suspicious. So she acted as guarantors. And of the men that she guaranteed, I'm sure a lot of those became, part of the guerrilla. So ano din yun, no? It's very risky on her part. But yan nga, yung very ominous letter na yan, she wrote it down just before she was taken by the Japanese. And her children remember their mother being taken. Late lang niya, not even 5 feet tall. Tapos may isang truckload of Japanese na dumating, and then she was flanked by 4 rifle-carrying Japanese. And to lessen yung sama ng pangyayari, Josefa, lovingly told Teresita, her daughter, who became the president of CCP, being Rojas in the future. Sabi niya, you play the piano, anak, something like that. Para hindi niya makita. So she, tumaliko siya, nag-play ng piano. And then yung recollection ni Teresita years after was that after she played, her mother was not, was already taken by the Japanese. So she was brought to Fort Santiago, where she was, incarcerated, grilled, and tortured until she was executed in 1945, just several days before the Americans came back. She was last seen beaten and weak sometime late January 1945. Together with other resistance fighters, she was brought to the North Cemetery where she was executed. Josefa Llanes Escoda's whole life has been one of devoted service to others. She was brave until the end, and her beautiful, courageous spirit will always be an inspiration for all Filipinos. In 1991, the Central Bank of the Philippines launched a 1,000 peso bill, which featured 3 prominent World War II heroes. Josefa Llanes Escoda represented the women's sector, Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos represented the civil government, and General Vicente Lim represented the armed forces. It was a fitting tribute to these 3 great heroes who resisted the enemy and gave their lives up for the nation. So, di ba, last December, BSP announced that they will be replacing the heroes in the 1,000 peso bill with the Philippine Eagle. So let us not allow this to happen. Our group has made a signature campaign, and we submitted this to BSP with 7,000 plus signatures. Hindi pa po tayo nakakatanggap ng sagot mula sa BSP. Sana ay pinagmumuni-munihan nila na wag nang palitan ang ating mga heroes. All right. So our next section is about our women spies and saboteurs. No? So in any war, intelligence is the key to bringing about swift victory. Here are the stories of some intrepid Filipino women who acted as couriers, spies, and saboteurs. Against overwhelming odds, they fulfilled their dangerous mission right under the enemy's noses, making an American officer exclaim, "My God, I never dreamed that Filipino women had such courage." So yan ang sabi ng Captain Blair. All right, so let's start with Josefina, or fondly called Joey Guerrero. So Joey Guerrero was a happy young mother in the 1930s, married to Dr. Renato Maria Guerrero. scion of one of the most distinguished clans in Manila. She lived a nice, comfortable life, blissfully unaware of things to come. First came the headaches, and then the extreme fatigue. Then her appetite waned, and soon suspicious skin lesions appeared. Her diagnosis came. She had leprosy. For a while, she was able to keep the lesions at bay, but once the Japanese occupation began, her access to medicine was cut off. Rather than sulk, she decided to do something worthwhile with her life. She made contact with the guerrillas and became a courier, hiding messages in her hair or inside her socks. Upon seeing her lesions, the Japanese would, back away and hurriedly let her go. No? Parang pangit pakinggan, pero parang pinandidirihan siya. But this became her best weapon, and she was able to smuggle in, messages from one guerrilla camp to another. And as the Americans returned, Joey was tasked to draw maps of Japanese fortification, minefields, and gun emplacement around the city. She pretended to take strolls, but was memorizing the landscape, jotting down areas where they were freshly dug earth, indicative of a landmine newly placed by the enemy. In early January 1945, she was told to deliver these maps to the American forces in Kalumpit, Bulacan. Despite extreme body ache and fatigue, she trudged the 40-kilometer route and reached the American camp, only to be told that the Americans had moved to the next town. Too weak to talk, she hired a bangka, or a native canoe. Too weak to walk, She hired a bangka and carefully avoiding an ongoing battle between the Hooks and the Japanese in the area. So upon reaching the American headquarters, she gave the map to Captain Blair of the 37th Infantry Division. Knowing the great distance and extreme risk Joey went through, Captain Blair exclaimed, "My God, I never dreamed that Filipino women had such courage." Because of her map, Joey saved thousands of American soldiers who would have walked right to their death. She was awarded the Medal of Freedom with silver palm, honoring foreign civilians who had done something courageous to save American lives. After the war, friends petitioned so she could be brought to Carville Reposarium in the US for treatment, the very first foreigner to be given this privilege. She was pronounced leprosy-free in 1957, and in the 1970s, she moved to Washington, D.C. When she died, none of her friends knew of her past or her family in the Philippines. Only when her obituary ran in a Washington newspaper did an old friend from 50 years ago surface to tell the world of her heroic past. Our next woman is Florence Ebersole Smith. So she was called the War Widow. She was born to a Filipino mother and American father. Yung father niya was a veteran of the Philippine-American War who fell in love with the Philippines and fell in love with her mother and decided to stay here, after the Philippine-American War. So she worked as a stenographer for the U.S. Army in Fort Santiago and married Navy man Charles Smith in 1941. But Smith was killed in action in February of 1942 during a mission to resupply troops in Bataan. So during the occupation, she worked for the Japanese-controlled Philippine Liquid Fuel Distributing Union. Haba na pangalan. So she was able to divert mga vouchers, and nabigyan yung mga guerrillas ng mga gas vouchers which they were able to use for their trucks and their other machines. And she also helped send food, medicine, and other supplies to POW camps. And especially when she found out that her former boss, Lieutenant Colonel Engelhardt, was in Santo Tomas as an internee. And then when the Japanese found out her, underground activity, she was arrested, interrogated, and tortured for months. Her interrogators, led by a Japanese who spoke good English, electrocuted her and confined her in a 2 feet by 4 feet box for days whenever they didn't like her answers. Fed only one bowl of lugaw per day, her weight dropped to a mere 80 pounds. When the Americans liberated Manila, she joined the U.S. Coast Guards to avenge her husband's death. She was discharged after the war, married Army veteran Robert Finch, and raised a family. In November 1947, recommended by her former boss, Lieutenant Colonel Engelhardt, she was awarded the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award given by the U.S. government, in 1995. The Coast Guard honored her by naming a building for her at Coast Guard Base in Honolulu. And this book about her life was launched last year. Okay, next is Magdalena Leones, so the Lioness of Filipino Guerrilla Ages. I'll make this quick because we're running out of time. So si Magdalena Leones was involved with the Filipino-American Irregular Troops, and then one of the members there was Lieutenant Colonel Franco Vera Reyes, who pretended to be a lieutenant who came back from Australia with MacArthur. So si Reyes, this guy, asked Leones to go to North Luzon and to Volkmann's this is Colonel Volkmann, Commander of sa 5th Northern Luzon, to get the roster of Volkmann's men, no? So si Volkmann became suspicious. Bakit kailangan to ng roster? So he interrogated Leones, and Leones said, I'm being asked by this, the aide of MacArthur to get your roster. So Volkmann became suspicious and sent an agent to Manila to check what's happening. And doon nila nalaman that this Colonel Reyes pala was actually a Japanese spy. And finorge ng Japanese yung kanyang mga passport and IDs saying na he was part of MacArthur's men who came back from Australia. And then and Franco Berales was responsible for many Filipino deaths. No? Marami siyang chinuchu ng mga Filipino resistance fighters. So when Volkmann found that out, of course, ties were cut with but because of the Leones's good work in intel, and she was able to bring in radio supplies from wherever. Dami niyang contacts eh. So Volkmann was really impressed by her. So after the war, October 1945, upon the recommendation of Volkmann, she received the Silver Star Medal, the third highest military decoration of the United States. To date, she's the only Asian woman awarded with the Silver Star Medal. Like many other resistance fighters, she went back to her quiet life, got married, and raised a family. In 1969, she migrated to the US and passed away in 2016 at the age of 96. In keeping with her final wish, her remains were brought home to the Philippines, and she was laid to rest in her most rightful place at the National Hero Cemetery. Marami siyang ginawa na intel and underground work during the war. No? Even made reports of ships coming in La Union and in Lingayen Gulf, and these were sent by Volkmann to MacArthur and really helped MacArthur plan his comeback. No? But the next group is hindi ko to sila pwedeng whenever I read stories about them, I feel that their stories have taken too long to tell. So these were the women of the streets, or the prostitutes of Manila at that time. I feel that people have to know about the great deeds of humanity perpetrated by this marginal group of women. So at the height of the Battle of Manila in February 1945, the residents of Malate and Ermita were herded by the Japanese to Plaza Ferguson, and the men were separated from the women and the children. The women were brought to the Bayview Hotel. Soon, the evil intentions of the lust-crazed Japanese became evident. Extreme fear, panic, and chaos ensued as the Japanese began searching for young virgins to rape. To protect the young girls and teenagers from being raped, the older women placed the young women to the back of the room, while they stayed near the entrances or the doors. A group of prostitutes, including white Russian prostitutes, called attention to and offered themselves so that the Japanese would spare the young girls. Though many were still victimized, many were saved by the selfless acts of these prostitutes. In Intramuros, the ancient Spanish city right in the heart of Manila, Dr. Antonio Hisbert, who was tending to the sick, the wounded, and the dying. This was during the Battle of Manila also, where Intramuros was already cut off, no? So walang makapasok na help, walang makapasok na aid, no? And Dr. Hisbert was inside San Agustin Church, no, tending to the sick and the wounded. So Dr. Hisbert has only high regard for the prostitutes of Intramuros. They saved many young girls from being raped by offering themselves instead. They also went out and helped bury the dead, which littered the streets of Intramuros. When Dr. Hisbert needed bandages, these women would go to the Japanese guards and be back later, bandages in hand. When he asked for alcohol, which he needed as disinfectant to ease the agonies of the dying, they went out to get these for him, and soon they came back with several bottles of gin or alcohol. In many of his talks after the war, Dr. Hisbert always called these women as heroines. So next is the battlefield nurses and doctors, and many of them volunteered for Bataan. But when they volunteered, they were considered civilians and did not have any ranks. Under the jungle canopies, somewhere near the tip of the Bataan Peninsula, 3 makeshift hospitals were built. General Hospitals number 1 and 2, and the Philippine Army General Hospital. Starving and overworked medical staff had also to contend with working under constant strafing. So habang gagamot sila and nag-o-opera, no, grabe, the bombs were falling. And in fact, one of those bombs killed General Luna, who ngayon, it was after him that the V. Luna Hospital here in Quezon City was named after. No? And the night before Bataan fell, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps was ordered to evacuate the corridor. At first, the order only applied to the American nurses. Their voluntary Filipino colleagues were ordered to stay behind and go home to their respective houses. However, Second Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, the head of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, dug in her heels and said, "If my Filipino nurses don't go, I am not going either." Her superiors conceded, and all of the nurses, civilian and military, Filipino and American, departed for Corridor. Meanwhile, all over the country, nurses volunteered, many attached to guerrilla units. When the troops moved, the nurses moved with them, climbing mountains and hiking for days while taking care of their patients. Sometimes the nurses were stationed less than 2 kilometers from the battle to be at hand for any emergency. Remarkably, these nurses served without any thought of financial reward or professional recognition. Many more served in far-flung areas of our country, but due to the non-combatant nature of their services, their stories remain unchronicled. They took great risks and carried on as gallantly as their brothers in arms, armed only with their Nightingale pledge to practice their profession faithfully and to dedicate their lives in devoted service to human welfare. Filipina social scientist Mina Roses summed it up best when she wrote, "The true Filipina, as our history reveals to us, was one who was full of self-sacrifice, devotion, and loyalty. But at the same time, she had common sense and had a head to rule her heart, was brave enough to go out with her menfolk and stay by their side until the last ditch. She did not mope at home, burning candles before her favorite saint while her home, her children, and her country were in peril." Never did these words ring more true than during the dark days of World War II. This period stood witness to the great strides the Filipina had accomplished, breaking gender stereotypes and proving her mettle. But while honors and accolades have been reaped on the men, the women's great feats of valor seem to have been forgotten in time. Despite their huge contribution to the war effort, women remain marginalized in World War II history narratives, and so much work needs to be done in this area. 80 years after the dust of war has settled, the world's collective war memory seems to be fading. Let us not make their memories fade, for these women's stories deserve to be remembered and honored by generations to come. And with this, I end my lecture. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for such an informative lecture, Ms. Desiree Benipayo. We will see you again later for the open forum. Yes, and for our last speaker for today, we have Mr. John Lee P. Candelaria from the Hiroshima University. Mr. John Lee Candelaria is a PhD student at the Graduate School for International Development and Cooperation, Hiroshima University, Japan. He finished his BA and MA in history from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His research interests include international relations, peace and conflict studies, heritage studies, Philippine and Southeast Asian history, heritage, memory, and memorialization in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. Mr. Candelaria also hosts a podcast on Philippine history, politics, and society. Now, once again, for his lecture this afternoon, we have Mr. John Lee P. Candelaria.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office of the Department of National Defense for the invitation to present this study. The title of this presentation and the study is Dainty Hands Do Useful Work, Depicting Filipino Women in Japanese Wartime Propaganda. This article was published in the journal Plaridel of the College of Mass Communication, UP Diliman. If you want to read the article, you may scan the QR code in this presentation using your phone. This article was also based on my master's thesis, where I analyzed images, cartoons, comic strips, and illustrations from the Tribune, the main propaganda newspaper of the Japanese during World War II in the Philippines. From more than 1,000 issues of the newspaper from 1942 to 1945, I found approximately 3,000 photojournalistic images, 300 cartoons and illustrations, and 250 comic strips. Using qualitative visual content analysis, the portrayal of women was identified as a prominent theme. From the selection of images that depict this theme, I further categorized them according to the representations they forward. But why do I focus on women portrayal? The way Japanese propaganda has been studied has always focused on the themes of Pan-Asianism, militarism, anti-colonialism, and self-sufficiency. Through the identification of the manner of women depiction in Japanese propaganda as existing along the lines of the themes I mentioned earlier, we could further enhance our understanding of Philippine society during war, when the forces of the Japanese and Japanese imperialism attempted to shape Filipino identity. In this article, I ask, how are women portrayed in Japanese propaganda? What were the reasons behind such depictions? And how different were these portrayals to how women were regarded in earlier periods of Philippine history? What did the Japanese seek to achieve in representing women in such fashion? But before we focus on how Japanese propaganda depicted women, first we must traverse the longer history of the Filipina and how she had been portrayed throughout time. I hope you could humor me when I refer to the women in the Philippines as Filipina prior to the proliferation of the term and concept of the Philippines. According to many scholars, in early Philippine societies, women were largely treated favorably. They occupied important positions in society. They headed barangays, they led and fought battles, they served as babaylan and spiritual leaders, and generally, they led productive lives. The Westerners who saw this situation thought it was bizarre. They were amazed of the women's centrality in Philippine society and sought to overturn this system. Thus, the subjugation of women was coupled with the colonization campaign. Catholicism sought to repress women, limiting the spaces in society where they could be active, dissolving the prestige that women enjoyed. The sphere of politics was limited to men. Education was also limited, and only the women of the elite could access a limited education that taught them basic reading and writing and, enough for them to pray and read the Bible, as well as teaching them needlework. So limited was the space for women that their aspirations were limited to being teachers, nuns, or spinsters. In the late 19th century, a sizable number of women were worked outside their homes as maestras or teachers, criadas or domestic workers, cigarreras or tobacco factory workers, matronas titulares or midwives, and tinderas or shopkeepers, among others. Some also worked as mujeres públicas or prostitutes. While it seemed as if the space for women has expanded, women still received lower pay and are subject to the harassment of their superiors. Women also had a hand in the Philippine Revolution and the Philippine-American War in many aspects, such as logistics, intellectual, physical, among others. Some even fought and led battles, but this does not mean that they were no longer vulnerable to abuse or that the revolution espoused gender equality. Greater access to public education during the U.S. occupation of the Philippines was a game changer for women, as now they had the ability to become professionals such as doctors, lawyers, and nurses. Women were also engaged in a lot of civic activities through the women's groups, which would lead to a demand for greater political participation, climaxing in the approval of women's suffrage in 1937. Thus, the U.S. occupation in the first half of the 20th century has been seen as an important time for women's rights. But it must be noted that only the privileged women had access to the well-being that came with these developments. The Filipina was still cast in the same mold. As the scent of war hung thick in the air in the 1940s, the Filipina was caught between two empires, the United States and Japan. And the Philippines' relationship with these two countries had a tremendous impact in the crafting of the Filipina's femininity. Thus, it is important to understand the gender discourse on women in the 1940s, especially during the time of war, as we could see how hegemonic forces attempted to shape the Filipina's womanhood during turbulent times. The first prominent theme of women portrayal in Japanese propaganda during the war was the woman's image as an indicator of normalcy. We see this as early as August 1942, when the Tribune featured a symphony concert under the New Order. The article was titled Balintawak at the Symphony, which was aimed at, and I quote, bringing out the best in Philippine native culture, end of quote. The article and the photos highlighted the women wearing beautiful dresses called balintawak dress. It's a traditional Filipino dress. And the article even noted that the dresses blended with the atmosphere of the music played during the symphony, and that classical music was not shallow as jazz. Jazz is a musical genre that was starting to get popular during the 1930s in the Philippines prior to the war. Another example of how women were used to portray the normalizing situation in the Philippines is through another feature in 1942. In the article, An Abbreviated Course of Study for Filipinos, two women pose in front of the room signage, as you can see here in this photo, where Japanese language is being taught. One of the women looked serious with a muted smile, while the other smiled more widely. Interestingly, the photo's caption quickly attempted to dispel the notion that the picture was staged, and that the smile could be taken as, and I quote, an expression of how enjoyable the session has been. It aimed to portray the joy of learning Japanese, which is not an easy language to learn. In another article, Filipino girl workers in factory prove efficient. Filipino women were shown in an assembly line weighing and packing poriko, a brand of vegetable lard. The women wore snow white caption aprons, and the image's caption titled Women at Work, you can see here, cited that such factory activity indicates a return to industrial normalcy. It was not enough to show men and women working together in the factory. Images of women participating in the work in the factory assembly line drive the point home further, that we are getting back to normal. While the usual propaganda line of the return to normalcy involved women, another aspect commonly attached to women was how they have been exposed to Western culture's undesirable effects. The Japanese urged that Filipinos be made aware of Western colonialism's consequences and abandon them immediately. The article, which is also the namesake of my own article, Dainty Hands Do Useful Work, featured images of women doing ordinary household activities such as ironing, cooking, cleaning. The article emphasized that the time wasted in pointless frivolity, especially by Filipino socialites in the bourgeoisie, could be better spent by learning skills useful in the home. The article featured a program where these women can learn the practical art of homemaking, which it claimed was essential for women to learn. These images aim to contrast women before the war to those who are now being re-educated under Japan's co-prosperity agenda. More articles and images showed how the war had changed the Filipino for the better. In an article titled 3 Types of Girls After 6 Months of War, the war was seen as to have upset the typology of the rustic barrio girl and the smart city sophisticate. Despite this, the article emphasized that the two girls, albeit different, proved equal to the emergency. However, the city girl has a wider gap to bridge in responding to the crisis since she was so consumed by Western culture that she forgot her quote-unquote Malayan traits. To adjust to the new normal, she had to cut down her flair for new and luxurious dresses, curtail her social excursions to the extent that her quote-unquote US manner waned. The barrio girl had little readjustment to do since she was used to simple life. The article ended by asserting that a third type of girl was created from the 2 types of girls earlier, and that this girl was the in-between type who gets bored with her daily sluggishness and finds an easy, profitable way of keeping pace with the times. The article came with 2 sketches that you can see here in the presentation. The city girl is portrayed as playing the piano, wearing a fashionable hairdo. She has thick makeup, a short skirt, well, short at least for that time, which of course showed her legs, and she's also wearing high-heeled shoes to match. On the other hand, the barrio girl is depicted in the idyllic countryside, wearing the traditional barot saya and tapis, and deftly pounding the palay with one hand, as you can see. This discussion shows how the women's image and the discourse of womanhood were adopted in Japanese propaganda in the Philippines to serve as proof that normalcy is established quickly and efficiently under Japan. However, this normalcy goes above and beyond the status quo under the United States, as propaganda made it clear that under the new normal, women can perform certain productive tasks that are indicative of their confidence in the new regime. The second theme prevalent among the images was focused on depicting the Filipina beyond the house and home. In a May 1942 article of the Tribune, a feature article titled "The Maestras Can Take It Too" discussed teachers' alternative careers during the war. The article pointed out that a misconception about teachers being allergic to manual labor or any other livelihood source beyond teaching was kind of popular. It was only through the war that this myth was disproven, as the maestras, quote unquote, rolled up their sleeves to sell fish, to sell foodstuffs in the market, to launder, to do work regarded as unconventional, end of quote. At least according to the article. Several images of women doing different activities, such as watching over food prices to maximize family income, gathering information for government as a form of social work, and even serving in the police force. This article and its images focused on other tasks that teachers can do because the reality was the war had disrupted the educational system and that these teachers were now out of jobs. As the teaching profession was one of the career options that had opened for women since the US occupation, these women teachers were now subjected to the unfounded assumption that they were allergic to manual labor. To say that the misconception existed is tantamount to saying that women who widened their dominion from the house and home were now seen as unwilling to do manual labor, discounting the fact that when female teachers go home to their respective families, they are still expected to do the household chores. In the backdrop of the war, the Filipino woman, according to this depiction, must find manual labor as a welcome break from the monotony of their professional careers and must lead by example, especially when their former students see them in, conducting tasks outside of teaching. The working woman's image is used to show that everyone must adapt, even if they were put in positions where, according to the article, the faint of heart is at a disadvantage. The Tribune is replete with the same kind of images. Women as members of the police force were touted as essential contribution to the new order. And pictures of them training accompanied the news articles that announced the initiative. The presentation of women in military formation while being observed by Japanese commanders and the showcase of women enforcers in police uniform could be seen as a way of imposing militarism and masculine ideals on women. Even the way the women's uniforms were designed looked kind of odd, as it did not consider the utility of overalls for women. While women in the police force were arguably progressive for its time, the context of the war and the structural gender issues that exist during that time betrayed a superficial widening of avenues for women's participation. Other jobs given to women include serving as conductors in city buses. In an article titled "City Bus Girl Conductor's Angelic Says Visiting Newsman," the author, Hitoshi Kozuma, cited how the women's femininity, masked by the term angelic, offers a reprieve to unromantic travel. The article starts with, "It is the same in Nippon cities. The girl conductors are really angelic." The imagery of women as a source of comfort and objects of sexual desire is juxtaposed to the conduct of a duty deemed as usually a male's job and essential for normalcy in a country at war. Accompanying this article is a photograph of women chatting in the vicinity of a bus. In another article titled "More Serious Pursuits in Manila's Changing Scene," a photo of another female conductress is shown, smilingly punching holes in a bus ticket as his male passenger gamely smiles for the camera. While such a job for women is unusual, during that time, the positioning of women relaxing between trips or smilingly carrying out her task belies that their jobs were physically taxing and demanding. In fact, according to the article, they work 8-hour shifts. Also note that in this image, the women are depicted as chatting, which could also be seen as reinforcing the idea of women as gossips. While in the other photo, the young woman had to be shown smilingly servicing a satisfied man. The tenacity of women to take on roles such as being bus conductors, which are traditionally seen as masculine roles during the war, is counterposed to signs of their femininity, as evidenced by their photograph. There were also articles where the role of women as self-sustaining entrepreneurs was praised as a response to the difficulty of life during war. A short article titled Shorts, Too Late to Classify, told of an anecdote of a woman, an old woman from Malate, who was converted to growing vegetables in her backyard. She planted seeds of upo and improvised some trellis for the plants to climb on. She reportedly sold more than 45 pesos worth of upo from her plants, and that's quite big money during that time. And with a wider plot to plant, she would be, quote-unquote, on the road to plenty. With this anecdote, it's a small drawing of a woman, an old woman, as you can see in the presentation, wearing traditional Filipino clothes. It's a sheer kimono, tapis, and an alampay, with a basket of upo on her head and the upo trellis behind her. The self-sufficiency narrative in the Tribune usually assimilated a woman's image, as a patriarchal society perceives dependency as the stereotypically feminine role. Subliminally, anecdotes such as this aim to get Filipinos to find ways to get food on the table, be it through backyard gardening or selling their own produce, as there is not plenty to go by due to the war disrupting agriculture. As the food scarcity worsened, backyard gardening became a full-blown campaign, and even the government agencies engaged in planting activities. But the image of women as entrepreneurs could also be seen in a bad light, as it was told in an issue of the comic strip Kalibapi Family, created by Tony Velasquez, the father of Filipino comics. In the strip, Nene, the story's young protagonist, asked her father why their neighbor Aling Anita is not always home. Her father responded that she is engaged in buy and sell downtown. With admiration, Nene inferred that she must be earning plenty of money and expressed wanting to do the same if she were older. Her father dissuaded her by saying that now is the high time for a woman to devote her interest in the upkeeping of her home, as we're in the stage of building the Philippine Republic. Nene responds with honto desu ne, which means I agree in Japanese. This particular issue of the comic strip, created by Velasquez, represented how women roles could be adapted to anyone's agenda. A working woman understands that she works because it is necessary for the new order, yet devoting her time into the household also supported the same endeavor. This flexibility indicated that there was nothing progressive in the way Japanese propaganda depicted women at work. What mattered more was how the women's image could be co-opted to serve Japan's aims. Another interesting depiction of women that regularly graced the pages of the Tribune was the Japanese woman. There were a variety of photographs of them interspersed in several feature articles, like in 1942, the article Music at Work talked about how factory workers in Japan practiced playing musical instruments during break times, and a Japanese woman is seen playing the mandolin. In another article on Japanese nurses, student nurses were photographed enjoying their leisure time by playing Chinese checkers and drinking green tea. In the article Japan's Industrial Might is a Potent Factor in Her Prosecution of This War, Japanese women were seen arranging masks, with a caption that women are worthy contributors to the war effort. These images could be explained by the manifest propaganda line of Japan that the factories and the hospitals are vital cogs of the war machine that is instrumental to Japan winning the war. However, women prominently being featured in these images could be read to serve a separate purpose. In the 1942 article titled Japanese Women Can Quite Equal Their Men in the Realm of Science, the meaning behind such depiction of women is somewhat revealed. And I quote from the article: in the Philippines, knowledge about the Japanese woman is based on 60% misinformation and 40% ignorance. The poor creature is an unwilling slave of man. The married ones are submissive to their lords and masters. The unmarried ones are geishas. Thus, the prevalent superstition. Another way Japanese women figure prominently in the Tribune is that they are often juxtaposed with Filipino women. It could be as subliminal as a feature on a Japanese singer, Michiko Namichi, noting that, and I quote, her handsome features resemble those of some local cinema stars. End of quote. Or as direct as a feature on Filipino girls and Catholic Japanese schoolgirls who became pen pals after meeting in person years prior. The feature article reproduced some letters sent by the women to each other, as well as photographs of the Filipino women's visit to Tokyo in 1939. The article reported that the Saint Scholastica girls impressed the Catholic Japanese girls of the Sacred Heart School in Tokyo by dressing in the balintawak dress and dancing tinikling. This of Japanese and Filipino women was done to assert that Japan and the Philippines, they are no different from each other, as the two countries are neighbors and they share a commonality, unlike the United States and the West. This attempt at finding a connection between Japan and the Philippines, however remote, is best represented by the short article written by Sasaya Ono titled Pretty Girls, where he asserts that there must have been something in the past that links Japanese women and Filipino women, exemplified by the similar way that they plant rice and work the field. Two sketches accompany this concise story. Both women are shown planting rice, but one is Filipino and the other is Japanese. While it could be argued that the same description of women planting rice applies to all Asian countries where rice is grown, particularly in China, Korea, and the rest of Southeast Asia, the effort to make such a connection, although forced, clearly showed how the depictions of women served a specific purpose in Japanese propaganda. In this case, it uses the feminine ideals of beauty, modesty, and the portrayal of women as sources of entertainment, overlooking the fact that planting rice is a physically challenging task. Sabi nga, di ba sa kanta, magtanim ay di biro. The three themes I have identified in my study show that the depiction of women was indeed crucial for Japanese propaganda. Portraying normalcy was essential to assure the occupied subjects that Japan's victory is imminent and that cooperation with the new order could only lead to the two countries' shared prosperity. The image of women was portrayed to bolster the claim of normalcy, as the violence, militarism, and the entire enterprise of war are perceived as masculine domains. Thus, if women were to take on jobs usually done by men, they were depicted according to the level of femininity that they bring to the job, like the angelic girl conductors of the city buses who still did feminine things such as gossiping. As argued by Bill Giesel in 2004, wartime persuasion assured women that their femininity would still be intact if they took on jobs tied to men. Often, their femininity is packaged in such a way that it added something new to the position they take on. A kind of a patronizing masculine gaze, as these values added were usually based on stereotypically feminine traits such as beauty, gentleness, attention to fine details, and the like. This masculine gaze is evident in the portrayal of women. As Elizabeth Mary Holt pointed out in her work, Colonizing Filipinas, discursive practices have specific functions at particular times and different places. The seemingly oppositional portrayal of women at work and the women at home only makes sense in the context of a country at war, when national survival rested on mobilizing everyone to take on roles they traditionally do not take. Women could take on jobs outside those that they traditionally engage in, but the home is still the woman's rightful domain. Women were called on to take public roles not to empower them, but to relieve the hardships of war. A noteworthy aspect of the depiction of women in Japanese propaganda that I found is how the image of a woman was co opted to argue for a return to Filipino customs and traditions. But what the Japanese see as native seemed to allude only to a period before the United States occupied the Philippines. Instead of envisioning a set of values and ideals from an earlier time, say the pre-conquest period, the wearing of the balintawak dress, the modesty and conservatism of women, the preference for music other than jazz, indicate a partiality to the Spanish colonial period, or at least the period of the Philippine Revolution, as many revolutionary heroes made their way into the numerous speeches of government officials, as well as feature articles in the Tribune. The juxtaposition of Japanese and Filipino women served another purpose, which more closely related to the anti-US and anti-West propaganda line of the Japanese. The forced linkage between the two women showed the mental gymnastics that Japanese propaganda had to go through to rationalize and justify the connection. In the painful stretching of Lincoln logic, what was left was the generalized musings of feminine ideals that, in their vagueness, could apply to the women of any country. My interest in analyzing these images and what they mean for Filipinos during the time of war was aimed at making sense of discourses that seem incongruent and illogical, if not totally anachronistic for the time. When I first saw the images of, a policewoman or women working traditionally male jobs in the Tribune, in a paper from the 1940s, I was awestruck. Were women really afforded such progressive space in the 1940s? Was Japanese propaganda intent on promoting a semblance of gender equality during the war? True enough, my analysis showed that no, this was not the case. War is a gendered phenomenon. Beyond seeing women as symbols of private obligations for which men fight, or as surrogate objects of sexual desire, the Japanese saw the image of the woman as instrumental in showcasing Japan's new order. Ultimately, the repression of women continued under the guise of a progressive and modern rule under Japan. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture. I am aware of the privilege I enjoy as a man doing a study on women, and I am in no way hoping to take away from the rightful space that women should occupy in the historical study of women's position in society and the fight for gender equality. But I am hopeful that regardless of gender, we can all join in the fight for a better position for women and all genders in Philippine society today. I look forward to a fruitful Q&A discussion later. Again, thank you very much. And if you're interested to reading the full article and seeing more of the images I used, please, you can scan this QR code using your phones. Thank you very much.
Rebellion. Sinabi po niya na although walang direct members or wala kang makikitang PKP documents directing its members to organize the Hukbalahap. Ang fact po niyan ay initiated siya ng PKP members and in-include po niya dito that he confirmed that Remedios Gomez po was part of the PKP. So yun lang po.
Marami pong salamat, ma'am. Now we request all our research speakers to please turn on your cameras. Marami pong salamat. Okay po. So let's have our second question. This is from CCW Aurora B. San Juan. Napatunayan po ba ang mga allegations against Dayang-Dayang? So I think this is for Ma'am Naomi.
Ay, ako pala. Actually, Miss San Juan, sa ang hukbalaha po kasi ay meron silang tinatawag na iron discipline and fundamental spirit po. So ito po yung mga sinusunod po nilang mga batas at kumbaga ang disiplina nila at makikita po natin dito ang moral values. And regarding po sa kung napatunayan bang allegations kay Dayang-Dayang, she was court-martialed at ayon po sa mga dokumento ng na inilabas ng hukbalahap ay sinasabi po nila na nagkaroon ng due process at investigation dito kay Dayang-Dayang po. Yun lamang po.
Thank you, ma'am. Now this is for Mr. Candelaria. The segregation between men and women still strong during the time of the Japanese occupation, despite that women work on jobs that were heavier than most men.
I think my study is trying to show that, of course, in Japanese propaganda, it shows that women are being afforded more spaces in society. But of course, the reality is not. But I won't say that there was segregation per se, as in segregation, the way we understand it from how it was, at least in the US. No, but the Japanese was trying everything they can to make sure that the Filipinos believe that, look, we're better than the Americans, we're better than the Spaniards. We are actually giving spaces for women. But of course, that belies the fact that they are just doing it because no one is available. I mean, most of the men are fighting, they are guerrillas, or they are, many of them are dead. So there aren't really much men available to do the traditionally male jobs. But then again, women doing male jobs does not indicate that suddenly progressive sila or suddenly liberal sila. Just that one, they're trying to do everything they can to say that, to tell the Filipinos that we are better than your former colonizers, and at the same time, it's a way for them to make use of labor that is available. So they make use of women as well.
Thank you very much for that, sir. Next question po. This one is for Dr. Torres. Now, sir, were the nuns infected by diseases separated from other unaffected nuns?
Yeah, that was actually the problem that they had. No, they were separated because when these nuns were placed in their infirmary, kasi may infirmary sila dyan eh, no? So otherwise, the place acted like a small hospital or a small clinic. No, the problem is talaga is, no matter how much they would be isolated or anything, no, kakahawaan din sila eh. But you have to remember the diseases that they eventually had, like dysentery, beriberi, was because of malnutrition and unsanitary practices. Kasi wala silang nagano na yung water nila eh. No? There was a problem already with the water main, tapos electricity and everything. So if there was supposed to be a disease that would be given by contamination or by infection, medyo from what I understood from the diary, nako-control, no? Nako-control nila yung infection. But if it is regarding to beriberi and dysentery, medyo may problema yun kasi it is from the very sources, for sources like the water and the food that they shared. No? So iba yung magkakaiba pa rin yung sitwasyon.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, this question is for Ma'am Benepayo. Of all the contributions of Josefa Escoda, what do you think is the most important left the greatest impact? Thank you po.
Hi, thank you for that question. No? So maaaring isipin natin yung pagbibigay niya ng aid to the POWs and the citizens of Manila. But for me, the greatest contribution of that Josefa gave was to mobilize the women's groups, the many different sectors of women, rich, old, young, rich, poor, young, old, to help in the war effort. I think that's the greatest contribution that she made. In fact, even the young women, in-entice niya na mag-volunteer dyan sa office ng National Federation of Women's Clubs so that the mothers can go to work, as many of the mothers then had to work because most of the men were, in the hills fighting as guerrillas. So most of the women had to fend for themselves and their families. So even the young, pina-volunteer niya yung mga estudyante na na-stranded dito nung gera who were staying at the NFWC office. Pina-volunteer niya yan, mag-nanny kayo, mag-daycare service tayo sa mga bata. Tapos yung mga mayayaman, na-mobilize niya to, give their wealth and their extra money to help in the war effort by, buying medicines and food, not only for the POWs, but for the poor folks of Manila, who by 1943-44, pahirap na ng pahirap yung food situation natin. So I guess her greatest contribution, even before the war and during the war, was really her mobilizing the women, yung pag-mobilize ng ating mga kababaihan. So, Pinay power. Yan ang masasabi ko.
Marami pong salamat. Now, we have another question po for Ma'am Hemera. Sa tingin niyo po ba naging sapat yung paaralan sa kagubatan at mga armas na nakuha nila Commander Guerrero upang maging handa sa pakikipaglaban sa mga Hapon? Salamat po.
Okay po. Let us not forget po that as early as the 1930s, the peasants, they were already arming themselves po. Okay? Kasi they predicted very well na magkakaroon ng world conflict kasi in-invade na ni Hitler nagkaroon ng invasion si Hitler at sila ang Japan sa Manchuria. So naghahanda na po sila, pero this is according to the interview of Luis Tarok in 1995. Pero pagdating sa kasapatan, at least in my own assessment, palagi nilang nirereklamo na problema po talaga ang pagkalap po ng mga armas, yung kakulangan sa armas. But they compensated it naman po ng kanilang bravery. Kasi in the first place, sa labanan naman, ang magpapanalo sa laban, ang isang pinakamahalagang factor is their attitude, their uncompromising attitude to fight for their country. Kaya makikita mo yung plano nila sa sa paglaya o yung paglaban nila sa mga Hapon and all. At noong 1943 po, nagbigay ng dokumento ang Balahap and telling MacArthur, may pirma po ito ni Luis Tarok, sinabi niya na nararamdaman na nila yung unti-unting paglaya ng major towns na dati ay occupied po ng mga Hapon. So hindi man sila sapat, hindi man naging sapat itong mga armas nila, nag-compensate naman po nila iyon. Okay, yun lamang po ang sagot ko dito sa question. Thank you po.
Now, this one is for Mr. Candelaria. What do you think is the impact of wrong portrayal of Filipino women during the propaganda, during that time and the present? Thank you po.
Yeah, it's hard to know the impact kasi we don't really have information regarding that. All the ordinary people are unfortunately, well, most of them are dead. It's hard to ask them if they remember what happened during that time, if it affected them. Actually, isa ring tanong lagi sa research ko na to, how were these propaganda received by Filipinos? And there's really no answer to it, of course, unless I try to look into existing memoirs during that time. But I think we know what happened after the war, right? The Filipinos were really not buying what the Japanese were telling them. And pagkatapos ng digmaan, bumalik lang din yung kung ano yung pre-war na situation on how women are perceived. in society. So, nagkaroon na ng pagpapatuloy kung paano yung pagtingin sa kababaihan, and it's still not good, no? At masasabi natin hanggang sa kasalukuyan naman yung impact ng women portrayal nandoon pa din. Hindi pa rin pantay yung binibigay na espasyo para sa kababaihan sa lipunan. And hopefully we can all try to change this situation. But I hope this study of mine contributes towards that aim, however lofty it is. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, sir. Next question po, this one is for Dr. Torres. Sir, how do you find the diaries of the nuns in Katipunan? Are they all incongruent to each other and show no bias? How credible do you think are they po? Thank you po.
Well, there is bias, of course, because these are personal memoirs of the nuns, no? And syempre, as a historian, you have to look through the bias, and you have, of course, to match it, no, or double check it with other existing facts, no? The diary of the Sor Carmen de San Miguel, no, was actually not just a diary, because in 1945. In 1946, no, until around the 1950, she was trying to reconstruct the archives of the Order of Purclares, which was totally destroyed in during the Battle of Manila. No? So whatever memory she had, she wrote it down. Whatever interview she could manage with the existing nuns. No? So ito yung mga bagay na she noted down. A big advantage she also had was that when the nuns were staying in San Francisco del Monte, kasama nila si Bishop Cesar Guerrero, dahil instead of being jailed because of his collaboration case, he was confined. It's like under house arrest at the Colegio Serafico. No? There were other papers that were that they managed to have, no, kasi a lot of them wrote about what happened during the war. Kaya lang yung accessibility nito was medyo cut off kasi the later abbesses considered them as private papers. No, I think nakalimutan nila ako yung nakahalap eh. Ako yung nakahalap nung diaries, because when they transferred from the Colegio Serafico in San Francisco del Monte to Katipunan, naiwan nila dun sa archives ng Franciscans. And while I was doing research there, na-discover ko na nakatabi lang doon sa isang tabi, nakabalot pa nga ng dyaryo, no, and everything. And I think they forgot to bring it. So I managed to have it photocopied. So, kaya lang, syempre, as time went on, termites, destruction, and everything, I also lost my copy of the diary. No? And but according to some of the nuns that I spoke to before in Katipunan, nasa kanila pa rin daw. No? In fact, they consulted from time to time. No? Unfortunately, no one has written a complete history yet of the Order of St. Clare in the Philippines, because one, the lack of documentation na nasira kasi nung World War II, no? And second, of course, it's still a contemplative order. No? They still confine themselves, no? And have very limited public mingling with the public, except on special occasions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Follow-up question lang po, sir. So for those po na students na kasama natin today na perhaps po they would also like to conduct studies po regarding po sa dito po sa ating mga sa inyong topic po, pwede pa po kaya tayong kumuha ng kopya, kagaya po ng pagkuha niyo ng kopya doon sa mga diary, or hindi po siya ina-allow sa public?
It's at a public record. Nakachamba lang talaga ako na it was left behind. No, and I managed to get a copy of it, to have it photocopied, but otherwise they don't allow it talaga. They don't allow it to to have it photocopied because that's their private papers.
Thank you very much for that po. Next, we have question for Ms. Naomi Hemera and Ms. Desiree Benipayo. Were the female guerrillas in general taught to use weapons before battle, or were they straight to battle na po, na gumamit ng armas? You can start answering po, Ma'am Desiree.
All right. For those that I have researched on, except for the hukbalahaps, I don't think there was a formal teaching of how to use the weapons. The hooks, they had their forest school, but for the rest, parang sabak na lang, ganyan. I'm sure there were, tutorial, quote-unquote, personal tutorial, but really nothing that formal as to be taught. And mainly because in most of the guerrilla groups, the women were not really, marami ring nasa battlefield, but not really as, commanders and, unlike the hooks, may mga mangilan-ngilan, pero karamihan sa kanila, sa mga aking readings, karamihan would be in the administration of the guerrilla group, in the auxiliary, as nurses and medics and doctors. So, but Yai Panlilio, even though she did not fight in the forefront, she was asked by Marking to carry a gun. So, I guess may konting personal tutorial doon, no? Pero siguro Ms. Hemera would answer more because of yung forest school nga ng mga hukbalahap.
Actually po, I don't have any statistical data if may formal training ba talaga sila or kung meron ba silang meron na ba silang alam before joining the hooks. But totoo po na meron silang forest schools at meron silang mga trainings. Okay, and yung trainings na iyon ay siguro kinukonsider nila yon as a formal military training kasi meron talaga silang organization no, meron silang organization at nagtitrain po sila no ng mga squadrons nila. Yan lang po.
Yeah, can I contribute?
Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the question actually is quite significant because ang talong kasi kung may formal training, no? Let us put it this way. Hindi madali pumatay ng tao. No matter what year, no matter how situation and everything, hindi madali pumatay ng tao, hindi madali umutos na pumatay ng tao. And you have to remember that these women guerrillas were facing that kind of situation. No? And ang magiging attitude talaga nila dyan, either mamatay ako, mapatay ko sila. No? And firing a gun is simple. Firing a gun at a person to kill him is totally different. You don't get any formal training for that, especially the guerrilla movement. Ang sasabihin lang sa iyo ng commander, ng mga mga commander sa guerrilla, kung hindi nyo barilin yung tao, ikaw ang papatayin yan. No, so it was very informal. No, it was very, and it also depends on the situation. No, and of course, many of these guerrilla commanders, including the women, had been traumatized more or less. Namatay ang asawa, namatay ang kamag-alak, namatay ang mga anak or something, and their hatred towards the enemy was also fueled by emotions. That aside from fighting for the motherland, they also had to not exactly avenge, no, but you could use the word avenge, no, of what happened to their relatives or their families.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that additional information. Okay, going next. We're now going to the next question. This is from Shian Rhea Takla. Good afternoon po. Is hukbalahap still active or is it already disbanded? I think this one is for Ma'am Hemera.
I thank you very much. Technically, iba-iba kasi ang timeline na pinopoint nila. So yung iba, 1954 daw, ng pagsuko ni Louis Tarok. And, pero the way I see it, 1964, yung time na na-arrest na tong si Lava. So disbanded ba sila o nag-i-exist pa sila today? I think the idea of hukbalahap still exists today, primarily because ang problem kasi noon ay lupa . So hanggang may problema sa feudalism, okay, yung sa tenancy ng sa tenancy sa mga lupain, especially sa rural areas po. Laging mag-e-exist yung idea ng hukbalahap, even though at wala na disband na sila, no, na disband na sila in 1964. Yun lang po.
Yeah, sorry. I can also say something about that. No, we also have to. It's a common error. No, and I think Ms. Naomi knows this. No, the Hukbalahap movement existed until the late 1940s. No, until they eventually changed their personality from fighting what was considered then an enemy of the country to the government. So the Huk actually changed from the hukbong mapagpalaya laban sa mga Hapon, hukbong laban sa mga Hapon, to the HMB, which is the hukbong mapagpalaya ng bayan. Now, these are almost the same, because when they felt that the government betrayed them after the liberation of the Philippines, many of them eventually still continued their ties towards the communists. Yung sinasabi nilang mga komunista, no? And it was the HMB that much later would become the forerunner of the NPA. Now when they started now fighting the government, no? So kung may nag-exist pang Hukbalahap, the Hukbalahap actually disbanded nung last part na lang gera ng World War II, no? And they eventually changed their identity to the HMB. They were still called Hooks, no? To the HMB when they eventually fought the government. No, tulad na sinabi na ni Ms. Naomi about land and everything, and of course the political statures. The time ni Rojas, around 1946, no? So by 1946, Rojas was already fighting anti-government forces, no longer the Hukbalahap, no, but anti-government force that was trying to now bring the downfall of the government. No, ito yung isang suliranin natin ng ating kasaysayan, no. Nagkaroon ng split personality ang Huk, the word Huk, no, from the Hukbalahap to the HMB. The last, from what I read, the last batch or the last group of the old HMB or the old Hooks, no, Hukbalahap, namatay ito panahon ni Marcos. No, they ended up killing each other kasi nga because of the problem of leadership. Yan sila Commander Alibasbas and everything. No, they ended up killing each other. Natuwa ni Marcos yun dahil natatanggal yung problema niya tungkol dito sa paglaban ng mga anti-government forces. Although at that time the intelligence was already coming out, but there was a new anti-government law in the creation, of course, of the NPA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, for Mr. Candelaria, this might be unrelated to your topic, sir, but is it true that in Japan, they do not teach the World War II history, and specifically the atrocities the Japanese Imperial Army soldiers committed against Filipinos?
Well, I'm currently studying at the university in Japan, in Hiroshima University, no less, a very important city of World War II. I find that of course, the ruling party is quite adamant in trying to, in Japan, quite adamant to try to minimize the attention given towards their role in the war. But as I have noticed, particularly here in Hiroshima, the discourse of war and their sins during the war is quite alive because, like for example, the Hiroshima Peace Park here really tells of the evils of war. So hindi ko gaanong ramdam yung sinasabi nila na sa Japan hindi pwedeng pag-usapan ng war or bawal ituro kasi a lot of elementary and high school students actually go to the Peace Park all over Japan to pupunta sa Peace Park to know more about the war. Although of course it can be said that what it tells is more of the story of Hiroshima being bombed more than the story of Japan going to these countries, invading and killing people, di ba? Pero I think nalalaman din ng mga estudyante or ng mga mag-aaral when they go to the Peace Park na equally may kasalanan din ng mga Hapon during that time. But I think yung sinasabing culpability ng Japan na hindi pa rin ito inaamin yung ginawa nito nung war, it's more of an issue of diplomacy and the Japanese government not willing to do that because it may incur them costs, among other things. But in my own experience, wala naman talagang pangingikil sa academic freedom ko. In fact, my dissertation, I'm doing something related to the memory of World War II and wars in general. And it's not like my advisors or the professors here are telling me that, you cannot do that topic because you're in Japan. No, it's not like that. So, but again, that's limited to my experience. I am more familiar with the Hiroshima experience more than the experience of Japan in general.
Thank you so much, sir, and we look forward for that you are currently planning for. Thank you so much. Okay, sir. Next po, this one is from Sir Bong Pestaño. This question is for everyone po. Is there any documented evidence during the period 1942 to 1945 of the so-called Filipino comfort women, either as Japanese collaborators or as intelligence assets and even as resistance fighters? Now, perhaps we can start with Dr. Torres po.
Yeah, I saw the question a while ago in the chat. I don't think there is no record of them being collaborators or anything. Because you have to remember that the case of the Filipino comfort women, pinilit sila. That's why they were called victims. They were forced to into servitude for the Japanese army to serve as like hindi man prostitutes, no, but to serve as comfort women, to comfort the Japanese. And this they didn't volunteer, no, and they didn't volunteer, and of course they did not ask to become comfort women, no, or to be part of the stables of comfort women, and eventually would think about I sige maging intelligence officer na lang and everything. But it's a way you have to understand the situation that they had, no? So for them being assets or anything, probably much later they were, no. But si Des already talked about the prostitutes of Manila at that time. And these are two different things from the Filipino comfort women, kasi these were Filipinas working as prostitutes even before the war, no? Dito naman sa comfort women, they were forcibly taken from their families by the Japanese to serve as their comfort women in the times of conflict. Now, so with regards to the question, is there any account or any, I think you would hardly find anything to say na they volunteer to become a comfort woman, no? Because as I said, pinilit sila.
If I may also add, Dr. Torres, thank you for that. Imagine a comfort woman being forced into sexual violence, tapos i-expect mo pa ba na magiging resistance fighter sila or magiging collaborate or intelligence officers? I think that's imagine the rupture in the person for them to function as something else. Of course, this is not to discount the capacity of women, but share ko lang din na yung issue ng comfort women, isa yan sa mga kinocontent ng Japan, because I think they don't want to pay more war reparations than they already did. But one of their contentions is that they are not forced into the comfort stations. They are actually paid to do so, and they're prostitutes, and they are willing. They are actually sexual workers. Parang ganun yung ina-argue ng Japan, which is of course against a lot of the record that we know. Ang masama lang, parang yung Philippine government, it really won't take up the plight of the comfort women. Unlike the Korean government, the Chinese, sila mas vocal sila. Tayo, ayaw natin. Kasi yung Philippine government, especially si Duterte, ayaw niyang matouch yung issue with Japan kasi baka yung partnership with Japan maapektuhan. Although we understand na may international relations agenda na kailangan panatilihin, but this is obviously a big injustice. If you remember the Comfort Women statue that was in Ross Boulevard was removed unceremoniously under Duterte ito. So kawa-awa yung state ng ating comfort women. They are slowly dying but they're not given the justice that they deserve. So gusto ko lang i-connect doon kasi we should also be vocal about historical injustices na hanggang ngayon ay hindi nasa-serve yung justice for them. And as Filipinos currently alive, we should take up the plight of the past injustices. So hopefully magawa natin yan through this forum then.
To add to John and Vic, no, between 1942 to 1945, there were no documented evidence. Sabi nga ni Vic, may hirapan ka talaga maghanap dyan because most of, if not all of them, were forcibly taken from their villages, and they were just 12, 13 years old. Maybe some of them were 16, 17, but 12, 13. Si Lola Rosa lang talaga yung, she was with the Hukbalahap, she was working with the Hukbalahaps, and na-snatch siya away from from group, but most of them were just young village girls na bigla na lang nawala sa village dahil kinuha ng mga Hapon. And a lot of them after the war, yung mga parents nila, of course may stigma yung times na yun, during that time, they were told to just keep quiet, hush hush, kasi it was very, alam mo na, during that time, to even talk about you being molested, baka grabe na di ba? Yun pang ginawa kang comfort woman. And yung sasabi ng Japan that they paid, quote unquote, the payment there, when I read an account of the comfort woman, was not really payment as sex slaves, but in the mornings, they did washing of the clothes of the army men, the Japanese sentries, they shined their boots and all, and they were given some money for that. Yun yung sabi ng isang lola natin, isang lola ng Lila Pilipina, mga lola na comfort women, na yun lang daw yung natanggap nila, but not really as money like prostitutes that they were being compensated. So yun lang naman yung mga dagdag ko doon.
Now we have a question from Mr. Bonilla. Good afternoon po. Question po for Ma'am Benifayo. Ma'am, bakit po kaya iilan lang sa mga babaeng guerrilleros ang kinikilala ng US, specifically in the ranks of PQOG, like the case of Mrs. Kunzalan, wife of Lieutenant Colonel Marshal Kunzalan of the PQOG Combat Unit, and my great-grandmother, a wife of Captain Molingbayan of the Kayaka Shoot, who was not recognized by the US. And ano po masasabi niyo sa mga ganitong case?
Hi, wow, PQOG pala yung mga kapamilya ng ating viewer, no? So, I would say that it's not really the American government's fault, but also parang fault din ng mga guerrilla leaders at the time because they were the ones tasked to write the roster of the group, no? And many of them did not include the names of the women. Siguro yung mga naglagay lang doon yung mga asawa nila or yung mga closest to that. And that was the sentiment of most of the women after the war, no? After having served, risking my life, risking life and limb for their country, their names weren't even in the roster. So, para sa akin, yun ang malaking injustice ng ating mga guerrilla leader at that time. Pinapad nga nila pero lalaki nilalagay, yung mga babae hindi nila nilalagay. And marami rin sa ating kababaihan, tumahimik lang noon dahil, parang for them, I just served my country, period. Di nila iniisip yung recognition, the medals that will come after. So, ganun ka selfless yung kanilang dedication to their countries. So, yun lang. For me, it was actually more the fault of the guerrilla leaders who made the rosters.
Thank you very much po. Next question po, this one is for Dr. Torres. How is the story of the St. Clair nuns vital in the whole narrative of the Battle of Manila and of the conditions of the religious orders during the entirety of the war?
Let me answer that question with another question. Have you seen a full study made of the religious orders during the war here in the Philippines?
Wala pa, Vic.
Wala pa.
Simulan na yan, Vic!
it's because it's because actually of one main reason, no. I'm not particular about any religious orders. I'm just going to mention it now. For one thing, the Jesuits were all Americans. They were all Americans here, and even though that they were part of they were priests, they were part of the Jesuit orders and everything. Lumaban sila because they considered it as their duty against the enemy, which is at that time. Kaya kinulong sila eh. Maraming nakulong na Jesuits, no? Because they were considered allied enemies of the Japanese Empire. No, some of them were confined in Los Baños, in UST. No, the other religious orders, no, were Spaniards. They were Spanish, and you have to remember that in the 1930s, Generalissimo Francisco Franco declared Spain neutral. So that is why, and of course, some leaders also of Spain gambled with the Axis powers. So technically, they were considered like allies, no? But the Spain at the time considered themselves neutral. Okay, that's why you can still see many of the accounts, no, of what happened to the religious orders in some books, no, but many of them remain confined in their archives, or they are just privately circulated works. So you won't see anything of that was entirely published by the religious order. There was one by the Capuchin monks, no, the Capuchin friars, who did a work. Yung Agustinian, alam ko may nakita akong small part lang. The Dominicans, of course, there was a published work by Father Juan Labrador of his diary, no, of what happened to the Dominicans after during the war. No, but there is one thing that you should also know about the diary of Father Juan Labrador. Edited ito, no, because he removed it was basically removed, and I cannot blame them. They basically removed some sections that were interestingly that showed collaboration with the Japanese. In fact, I remember natakot yung mga, from what I understand, natakot kasi yung mga ibang religious orders about their status during the war. No, dumating ang mga Hapon, they were neutral. Of course, some of them still collaborated with the Japanese. I'm calling it collaboration, no? Collaborated with the Japanese. The Americans returned, and of course, they started now sweeping through the area and arresting collaborators. Until today, if you look through the, hopefully binalik na, until before when I was doing research on the Dominican order during the Second World War, ang daming walang dokumento between 1941 and 1945. No? Makikita mo yung dokumento, nakalagay na December 9, dumating ang gera, binomba Pearl Harbor. Tapos, from December 9 until January 31, wala lang kayong makita dun sa mga records nila. No? Sometimes may masastray na records. No? That is why it took me a while, and I'm glad that I helped this person, si Dr. Ernesto De Pedro, the one who handled the Takayama beatification. No, I helped him with his research on that because part of the Takayama beatification was the consideration by the Japanese administration, the Japanese Imperial Army, with regards to the beatification of Takayama, of Lord Takayama, who was made a symbol of the Japanese administration. Now you have to remember, we were a Catholic country. The Japanese were not. No? So, and they made use of the symbol of Takayama. And of course, the Catholic unit. No? We seldom read about the Catholic unit at that time, to help the Japanese with to help the Japanese gain cooperation from the Filipinos. But that cooperation was totally fell apart in 1942, 1943, with the death of Bishop Philemon of Calapan, Mindoro, when he was killed by the Kempitay, because he refused to make one of the schools in Mindoro a house for comfort women. Nagalit ang mga Kempitay, pinatay siya. So, how important is the role of the religious in the history of the Second World War? It's very important because that is always a missing part. We are a Catholic country. We do not have any definite history on what happened to the Catholic Church, or in fact, any other religious order. No, even the except for the Protestants, kasi the South of Americas, lumaban talaga sila. No, but I remember there's still being some researches still being done with regards to the role of the Aglipayans, no, as anti-Japanese order, an anti-Japanese order during the war. The Japanese feared the Aglipayans because they said they are very secretive now. So yeah, no, it plays a very large part. Just to answer the question, it plays a very large part. The problem is, the real research should be done to consider that. The documents are there. In fact, there is an entire set of volumes in the Vatican, because nauna na sila mag-investiga nun eh. That is unfortunately, you have to ask permission from the Vatican Library to access it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, this one is for Ma'am Naomi Himera from VRMD Aris, from Veterans Records Management Division, Sir Aris po. Bakit wala daw po si Commander Tapang sa Hapbalaha presentation po kanina?
Okay, sorry po. Due to time constraint, hindi ko na po nasama yung iba. But that hindi po ibig sabihin nun ay hindi natin kinukuha ang kanilang heroism or nire-recognize. No? It's just that ang scope lang nung presentation ay yung mga high-ranking official na binanggit ni Louis Taruk sa kanyang, if I'm not mistaken, second chapter ng kanyang autobiography. So, yun lang po.
Thank you very much for that, ma'am. Maybe we can ask you to do another lecture po in the future. Okay po. Next question, this one is for Mr. Candelaria. This is in connection with the comfort women topic a while ago. What, in your opinion, should our government do to assist in the campaign to secure justice for comfort women?
Well, ang hirap naman ng tanong, no? Kasi ang normative kumbaga, pero I think the government can start with first looking for where that comfort woman statue is, because it's suddenly gone. Even I think the ones who tried to the ones who commissioned it can't find it anymore. Hindi naman kasi kailangan na maging hostile tayo sa Japan and say that you should pay this. Hindi naman kailangan mapang-away agad, no? Pwede namang simulan natin by ensuring that the memory of the comfort women is alive here in the Philippines. And then hopefully when we have amassed enough consciousness about their plight, then maybe the government can take it up diplomatically. Kasi ang nangyayari ngayon, mas vocal talaga yung East Asia, yung Korea and China with this issue, na para bang nakakalimutan ng mundo na yung comfort women nangyari din sa Southeast Asia. But I think because comparatively unfortunately mas mahihirap na bansa yung Southeast Asia kumpara sa Korea and China, na wala tayong tapang kasi wala tayong political might compared to these countries. And I understand that, no? But I think we should balance our economic and international agenda with our quest for justice. So naniniwala ako na memorials and monuments serve a transitional justice mechanism. So first, let's recognize here, not here, there in the Philippines, let's recognize yung plight first, no? Before we can even think of taking it up diplomatically with Japan.
Thank you, sir. Now, we also have another question from Kenneth Vergara, question for Ma'am Desiree. There were many professions of the women mentioned in your discussion, journalists even in the showbiz, which was very interesting. Apart from this, were there other professions that you are knowledgeable of? Thank you. Ma'am, you're on mute po.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Interestingly, many of the guerrilleras then were teachers. No? Hindi ko na nasama sa dami ng ating sa pagkakulangan ng oras, no. Pero marami sa kanilang teachers who, when one of them nga even said when the Japanese asked her to put down the American and the Filipino flags in her classroom, ayun na, she took to the hills na daw talaga. Marami sa kanila teachers. Of course, I've discussed the many other professions, but yun, teachers. If you know of that famous photo, yung matandang babae na nakaganyan siya doon sa kay Lupiba, no, the young American GI, Filipino American GI. Yun, Nieves Fernandez was a teacher. So marami sa kanila kasi they were also the ones who mas ano ba tawag diyan, mas liberal and mas educated, so they knew how to fight for their rights. So yan yung isang masasabi kong dagdag na profession na hindi ko na masyado na singit pa kanina. Ay, to add lang to the comfort women pala, no? yung the importance of the memorials, gusto ko lang ma-add kasi I was so surprised when I went to the States, San Francisco, in a small private park, there was this very nice memorial to the comfort women of China, Korea, and the Philippines. As in, 3 bronze statues, 3 young girls, playing pa ganyan. Isa doon, Pilipina, nakabarot saya natin. So parang nalungkot ako, nakita ko bakit sa bansa natin mismo, tinatanggal. Diba? And to the question ko nasa na ba, the government said it was returned to the sculptor, but no, this was funded, a lot of it was funded by Tessie Angsi's group, diba? And Tessie would always email me pag may mga protesta. Yung last protesta sa Japanese embassy, puro matatanda na mga kaming kasama namin, ang daming pulis. What for? Gusto ko sabihin, it's a quiet protest saying, ba't nyo tinanggal? Ganyan. Ang daming pulis. And yung gobyerno natin nagpadala ng pulis, di ba? Parang nakakainis naman yata yung thought na yun. Di ba? It was just a quiet protest saying bakit tinanggal at ba't hindi natin ibalik. This was close to the time that the government removed it in kunyari DPWH daw road widening. Road widen yung parte na yun ng Ross Boulevard. Ridiculous, di ba?
From what I remember, nasa sculptor yata. Yung ano.
Yun nga yung sabi. Yun yung sabi.
Tilago yata niya muna kasi pending any resolution that if they want to put it up again. Tilago yata niya sa sa workshop niya. I forgot the name of the sculptor.
I don't know, Vic, if you heard of it, but there were reports that the Redemptorist fathers wanted to put it in their compound. Sa Baclaran Church. Yeah. That would be also nice, di ba? Pero nothing came of it. So I'm not sure if it's also political or baka because nagka-pandemya lang tayo, but sana naman matuloy, di ba? Kung yung ibang bansa kaya nila ilagay, hindi natatakot sa hindi natatakot sa repercussions, quote unquote, with Japan. Di ba?
But as of the moment, yeah, I know it's in the workshop of the sculptor. Tilago niya muna doon.
It's beautifully made. It's not even, it's maganda. Hindi siya offensive, di ba? Napakaganda, actually.
Thank you so much, sir and ma'am. Now, a question for Ma'am Naomi Jimera from Armand Grospe. Was it hard for female Hukbalahap members to gain recognition for their resistance efforts due to their organization's communist background? Ma'am?
Actually po, that's correct. Hindi lang po sa kababaihan, kasi part naman talaga na nasasama sa silences ang kababaihan, but ang Hukbalahap in general, nahirapan sila sa recognition. And if I'm not mistaken, sa US recognition, it's just the banal regimen. So how much more kung ang kababaihan pa, very specific pa tayo.
Very much for that, ma'am. Next question, this one is for Ms. Benitayo. still po in relation with a recognition po, did the women of the street who helped the soldiers and most notably the young women ever receive official recognition, or is the recognition for their efforts precluded by their scandalous background?
Nobody ever got any recognition for that. In fact, hindi nga napapag-usapan eh. Only when I read accounts about the Battle of Manila, doon ko lang yan nakita. So, I really deemed it necessary to include them in my talks, no? Because of, the great humanitarian work that they did. In fact, we don't even have a name. Wala man ni isang mention ng pangalan ng isa sa mga prostitutes noon, ano. But Dr. Hisbert was so grateful to them and always, gave them, high regard and recognition whenever he was asked to talk about the Battle of Manila. And in fact, he said, ito is nakakalungkot. Napasa ko lang din to, no? Pag nakikita daw niya yung mga women na yan, every Tuesdays when he would, walk his route from his clinic to his house after the war na, and then he would see this group na tumulong sa kanya to get bandages and alcohols. And they would wave at him, dyan sa may Quiapo, near Raon. And they would be there every Tuesdays because they held a mass for them. Parang nag-offer sila ng mass every Tuesdays. So kung titingnan mo yung the signs of the times, unang-una yung kanilang career, ay yung kanilang mga profession, di ba? Para bang hindi yan kinikilala. Pangalawa, to offer a mass on a Tuesday. Not even a Friday or a Saturday, di ba? Yung parang very lowly weekday. Dahil yun lang siguro yung pinayagan sila. Ang sakit, di ba? Nung nabasa ko, parang naawa ako sa kanila. Tuesday lang sila nabigyan ng slot, parang ganun. Pwede naman sanang Sunday, ang daing misa, di ba? Saturday. Pero siguro, yun yung isang, yun nga, tama yung ating viewer saying na, because na-preclude ng kanilang, profession, which is really, really sad, kasi they did a lot to help. No? Not just that, personal accounts of our members in Memorare Manila would say one of them is Ambassador Isabel Wilson. And she personally told me na talagang sinave sila ng mga prostitutes. No? Talagang they offered themselves. So this was a personal account to me, which really, made me more intent on including them in my talk. Yun.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we have question for everyone po from Andrea Sakla. Did these women had post-traumatic disorder after the war, and as written in any articles, diaries, or etc., or what are the psychological effects of the war on these women? You can start off by answering po, Ms. Naomi, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much. So kagaya na nabanggit po nila ni Dr. Torres earlier, may mga members po talaga ng resistance na naging victims po ng Japanese atrocities, no? And one of my interviews, isa sa kanila ay victim pa ng Death March. Okay, at naging nurse siya sa Death March. At maraming kinocommit na violation sa kanya, sa family niya, sa mga kapitbahay niya, at nakikita nila yon. So although meron pong although wala akong medical data, no, for sure it's part of the war po. No, parte po ito ng giyera, yung repercussions po ng giyera.
Thank you, Ma'am Hemera. Would you like to add something to it, Sir Torres?
Yeah, tama to sila, tama si Ms. Naomi na actually the post-traumatic stress it also depends on the degree of the trauma that happened to these survivors of the war, no? I remember si Lourdes Montinola, diba? It took her almost 10 years before she finally narrated what happened to her family was massacred. No, 10 years before she finally, I think it was more than 10 years pa yata, before she finally narrated of what happened to her family in the Battle of Manila. Sila yung may-ari kasi ng UE.
FEU.
FEU. Sorry, ng FEU. And tawag dito, I remember when her book was first published, no? They really had to admit that it was like 10 years of silence, 10 or more years of silence. before she finally decided to talk about it. Now, what is surprising that until today, as I said, it depends on the level of the trauma, there are still some survivors who would not prefer to talk to what happened to them during the war.
Mhm. Very traumatic, yes.
Very traumatic talaga.
And siguro at that time, dagdag ko lang din kay Vic, no? At that time, parang they didn't diagnose it as PTSD, eh. Hindi nila alam
Yeah.
kung ano ba yon, di ba? But in the very few women wrote about, wrote their memoirs, eh. Unang-una, yung kapilipinuhan nga, di ba, Vic, we're not fond of writing. Isa yan sa nakaka-frustrate, no? Pag researcher ka. And second of all, lalo na yung kababaihan, no? Very few women wrote their memoirs. But in the memoirs of those who did write, like si Yay Panlilio and si Florence Finch yung nabanggit ko kanina. It was not her memoir, but the book it was a biography of her, no? Since both of them were medyo privileged dahil half American sila, no? So they had the chance to flee after the war. So they both went to the States for several months in their terms to recuperate. Diba, no? Pero yung recuperate na yun na because of the depression that the war brought and all their trauma and the sufferings that they suffered. But they really had to find time off, so away from the chaos, away from this, kasi even if they were in Manila, it would be hard because you see pock marks everywhere at the time, sunog na bahay, gibang naguhong building and all. So they had to flee to recuperate, no? Those were the words at that time, but that was really PTSD. Hindi lang diagnosed, no? And yung nabanggit nga ni Vic, si Tito Lourdes Montinola, 1990s na niya or early 2000s na nasulat yung libro niya, and she was already 70-something. And to this day, whenever I ask her, Tita, can I interview you, for Memorare Manila? Ayaw niya. She wouldn't agree to be interviewed. Ayaw niya. And yung book na yon, lakas loob lang because she went to a creative writing class and her coach was very good. And hindi naman na-motivate siya to write about her experiences. It's a very good book if you have time to. Very few women nga wrote, no? So, yung book ni Lourdes Montinola, what's the title nga, Vic? Forgot, but it's very nice. Hindi siya makapal. Easy reading. Second, for those of you interested, Pesita Pestaño Jacinto also wrote Living with the Enemy. Babae din yun na nag-write ng memoirs niya, no? Napaka-konti, pero ang ganda-ganda pag babae ang sumulat dahil iba yung perspective. So for those of you interested, sana makahanap kayo ng yung memoirs written by the women. And definitely you see PTSD in one form or another in the on the latter part of the war or after the war. Yun.
Thank you so much, Ms. Benipayo. Would you like to add insights on this one, Ms. Himera?
Hindi na po. Okay na po yung nasabi nila.
Sir Candelario po?
Yeah, nalala ko ng experience ko talking to World War II survivors in Los Baños where I used to teach. Talagang umiiyak sila pa din. And to think that parang antagal na since it happened. But we must also remember that Philippine society during that time, ang laki, nabanggit to ni Ma'am Benipayo a while ago, ang laki ng stigma for a woman who has been raped to talk about their experience, na para bang na-rape na nga sila, if they talk about it pa, iisipin pa na parang nawala na yung dangal nila, nawala na yung puri nila, mababa yung tingin sa kanila sa lipunan. And I think hanggang ngayon nagpapatuloy ang ganyan eh. So sana maging reminder din to na not even kahit tapos na yung war, yung pagtingin natin sa posisyon ng kababaihan, what dictates their honor. Kapag na-rape ka ba, wala ka ng puri. Parang ganun kasi yung tingin, ano? And it was difficult for them to talk about it, not because they don't want to share, but because they don't want to be seen as lesser beings by society. Diba? So, tumatahimik na lang sila. And sabi nga naman Minipay, it took a long time for them to talk about it. But yeah, sana magbago yung pagtingin natin sa ganito, no? At hopefully yung Pilipinas nasa yung lipunan natin nasa mas advanced na antas na siya, na kaya na nating tanggapin na dapat ang hinihingi natin ay justice for them, not to look down on them just because they were victims.
Thank you very much for that po. And it's very timely din po na we are having this kind of conversation in this month of March, which is Women's Month po. So thank you very much for opening up this conversation po. So next question, this one is for everyone. How do you think we can incorporate this topic to our educational system and as well as for the future researchers in relation to the topic of World War II in the Philippines? You may start po. Sir Candelaga, you may start.
Well, if you remember, there was this House bill recently introduced in Congress na dapat daw magkaroon na i-allot at least 50% ng history classes sa tertiary level sa World War II in honor of our heroes. But I think mali siya. Mali yung ganitong pagtingin na dapat 50% ng history classes World War II. I understand we should remember the lessons from war, but World War II is but like 3.5, 4 years of our history. Maraming nangyari, yes. Mahalaga siya, yes. But it doesn't mean that we discount the rest of the historical periods of Philippine history and the Philippine experience. But I agree, dapat siguro mas maging balanse yung pagturing natin sa World War II sa pagtuturo ng kasaysayan. But at the same time, hindi lang naman din schools yung venue where we can learn about the war and the lessons from it. Although I would warn a very military-centric na pag-appreciate sa war. Like if you also remember, if you've read in the news, the DNR is actually building a memorial, a battle cannon replica in Manila Bay. For some reason, an environmental protection agency building a cannon replica for what? But it's because I think yung head ng DNR, si Simatu, is a former military guy. Gustong i-focus talaga yung military aspect. We should be wary of this kind of remembering World War II because World War II isn't just about the military. Mm-hmm. It's about civilians. If you remember kung gaano karaming namatay, I think for every soldier that died, I think there's like 20 or more civilians who died. And in remembering World War II, we should not only remember the military's aspect, but also the civilians. Kasi mas maraming namatay na civilian nung panahon na yun eh. And of course, I understand. I am speaking at an event by the Philippine Veterans Affairs. I understand yung focus ng PIVAW, but ibalanse natin yung pagtingin natin sa nakaraan natin. Hindi lang militar dapat, pati yung mga karaniwang tao, tulad ng kababaihan.
Just a small comment. When I first heard that proposal, that kailangan daw 50% ang ituro, ang unang pumasok sa isip ko, dadami invitation kay Des.
Yun talaga, Vic!
But on my part, I teach Philippine history in college. No, one of the things that we did, was to remove but to make history thematic. No, and if you make history thematic, you will tend to cover everything, especially from the creation of a nation, so on and so forth. No, hindi na kayo magfo-focus sa small matters, yung kailan ang death march, ilan namatay sa death march. It focuses now on the bigger picture of what happened to the country during the war, and we were talking about, like was being discussed here, valor, the value of course of loving your country, so on and so forth. No, but we are not going to remove the trivial or the trivia. We're not going to remove the trivia from history because it's the trivia that adds color to it. But you have to remember the fact that one of the difficulties that we have, and I am talking with the professors here of history, is that it's so difficult to discuss 500 years of history in like 3 months or 4 months, 4 months of one term. No? At hindi mo ipa-memorize sa lahat ng mga bata yan, no? Sa lahat ng mga estudyante mo. Yeah, so again, the solution, and I'm addressing it in a bigger way, the solution probably to teach something like this and include it in our educational system is to make an educational system that will tend to cover the subjects of history in a thematic way. It's easy for me to say this, I have to admit, because ginagawa na namin ito sa Lasal. But it has to be formulated in such a way, no, that it will remove a lot of the, it will remove a lot of the obstacles in teaching a fully appreciated history of our country. Martial law, pinoproblema natin kung paano ituturo kasi hindi umaabot eh. Hindi umaabot yung mga buwan. So what more about World War II? Ginawang 50% pa. Eh paano naman yung martial law? No? So it's that kind of thing. You have to really restudy and probably reformat in an agreeable or appreciable way of how we are supposed to look at our history. Thank you.
Ako naman, when that bill came out, I was part of that group who initially, was thinking of, proposing that bill. But during the course of the, naging sobrang busy ako, so I had to leave the group. So nagulat na lang ako nung lumabas na yung bill na yun. And I said, oh no, for sure, I had mixed feelings, even though World War II Memorial Foundation, I had mixed feelings because forcing the teachers to teach World War II would be even more detrimental, di ba? I had mixed feelings with that. Pivaw knows that actually, no? So, sa ngayon, ang masasabi ko lang, tingnan muna natin, siguro not in the college level, but in the elementary level, where basic Philippine history is being taught. Umiikot ako sa schools and we screen our movie Honor about the life of Jose Abad Santos, which John earlier said, no? The war, kung titignan mo siya from a military viewpoint, ang hirap eh. Di ba? Ako nga, kahit na ilang taon na akong, researching on World War II, hirap na ako mag-memorize ng, 26th Infantry, 31st Division. Ang hirap, di ba? But my focus is more on the human experience during the war. And yun yung ipalaban natin sa mga bata dahil mas maraming civilians na nawalan ng buhay. Mas maraming civilians na nahirapan during the war. So with our movie, we go around and I see the enthusiasm in the children's faces. My God, I tell you, grades 5 and 6, umiiyak when they watch the movie. And then after that, they'll come to me. One grade 5 student of Xavier School even said, I have a renewed sense of patriotism. Sabi ko, renewed talaga. Ibig sabihin, nawala. Diba? So, if you talk about December 8, 1941, na tayo, binomba tayo, January 2, they entered. If you talk about dates and names and places, World War II is such a boring subject. But if you look at it, kung ano yung na-experience ng mundo, ano yung experience ng tao, ng militar, then that makes it worth learning and teaching. So for all the teachers out there, I have been always offering our services. If you want, make your curriculum as interesting and as lively as possible. Sabi nga ni Vic, going dramatic, no? So, we can screen our movie Honor there about the life of World War II hero Jose Abad Santos, who did not even carry a gun during the war. But he was a World War II hero, di ba? Yung ma-emulate ng normal na tao. So, we can help you. We can give you, we can help you with your curriculum, with visual aids, teaching aids. Yan sasabi ko lagi sa mga teachers, it's not that the children don't have interest. They do. I know when I screen Honor in schools, grabe yung interest ng mga bata. It's just we have to present the right material. Yan talaga. Children now are very visual. Huwag mo siya bobombahin ng dates and places and events. Lalayasan ka niyan, di ba? So, make it visual, dramatic. Sabi nga ng aking kaibigan na si Vic. Dramatic kasi yan si Vic kaya ganyan So, yon, make it more interesting. No, it's not a matter of putting it into law, but as history teachers, you have room to improve the teaching of World War II history. Yun lang.
Yes po, I must agree po, as a teacher of history for the past 6 years talagang if we bombard students with facts, talagang they will hate history forever. For a while po, sorry. Okay, my apologies po. So siguro po I must agree po doon sa thematic way of presenting important documents kasi talagang if ang purpose natin is to instill them nationalism, hindi nila kailangan ng i-memorize lahat ng facts kasi pag nasa puso na nila, automatic yan, nasa isip na po nila. So especially now na ang curriculum po, we have readings in Philippine history and ang daming mga documents. So, alin po ba dito yung ilalagay natin at ituturo natin sa mga bata? At paano natin ituturo yun? Well, I think po, let us not bombard them with, with lots of facts. And tama po si Ma'am Desiree, no, talagang kaya natin i-instill ang patriotism sa mga bata if tama po yung approach natin sa kanila. Thank you so much po.
Thank you so much po to all our speakers for answering that question. And for our last question for this afternoon, have we recovered from the devastation of World War II?
Ako na po mauna.
You go ahead.
Siguro po, in terms of rehabilitation and rebuilding, may makikita tayo mga progress, no? Especially that during the war, isa po tayo sa mga devastated talaga eh. However, siguro spiritually or mentally, kagaya ng napag-usapan kanina po, hindi pa tayo fully recovered eh. At tayo po napakaswerte natin, no, dahil ang henerasyon natin, naabutan pa natin yung mga war veterans and makikita natin na hindi pa sila nagkaka-recovered mentally or tinitake pa rin nila yun. Pag kinikwento nila yung nangyari in the past, no, yung experiences nila sa war, umiiyak pa rin sila. It's as if na it happened yesterday. So, yeah, like what I said, no, rehabilitation and rebuilding, may progress tayo, but spiritually and mentally, hindi pa fully recovered especially yung mga nakaranas ng war. Yan lang po.
If I may answer next, I think kasi as the generation that did not directly experience the war, but I grew up listening to my grandmother's stories of their hardships during the war in Catanduanes, talagang we can only witness the war through those who experience it, and they're all slowly dying. Of course, we all die naman, but unfortunately, may mga controversies, injustices na hindi pa rin na-solve, hindi pa rin nasusolusyonan, at hindi pa nabibigyan ng attention. So with that, I don't think we could ever say that we are free from all the troubles brought to us by this great war, no, this big war that we experienced. But I think what we can do is to continue demanding justice, no. Nananatili pa rin naman siguro yung movements ng comfort women to recognize their plight. Maliban pa doon, dapat din siguro ipaglaban natin na manatili sa alaala, sa gunita natin na pinagdaanan natin yung experience na ito. I think the same can be said for the colonial experience of the Philippines under the Americans, under the Spanish. These are all events that had a great impact on Philippine identity, and to say that it would ever go away, I think is not it's not compatible with the way historical consciousness works. It should remain with us. Dapat manatili siya, and it should remind us of the journey of Filipinos and the Philippine identity and who we are today. Bahagi yan ng identidad natin.
Sige, ikaw muna.
Sige, last si Professor Vic, syempre. Sabi ko lang, I think we haven't really recovered from the war, no? Sabi ni Miss Naomi kanina, siguro buildings have been erected after the war, memorials have been placed, streets have been named after World War II heroes, but really, has our subconscious, recovered from this? In fact, kanina na do sa talk ni John, he talked about the buy and sell of during the war, no? Yan, that's what tided people over during the war. Buy and sell kahit na ano. And sa likod nitong buy and sell, yung panggagancho din ng tao. Grabe yung pag-increase ng presyo, di ba? And during the war, because food were scarce, grabe yung yung profiteering, yung anong tawag dyan, hoarding, yung pagkakartel ng asukal, lalong-lalo na nung panahon na yun, So parang hindi pa yata nawawala sa atin yun hanggang ngayon. 'Di ba? Yung mga pag-uugaling masama na nakuha natin dahil sa because of the war, yung pagnakaw yung pag-loot ng Japanese warehouse at pagkuha ng mga hardtack biscuits. Okay lang nung panahon na yun kasi yung Hapon naman ang kinukuhanan natin 'di ba? Parang bit-bit pa rin natin hanggang ngayon. So may mga ganun na hindi maganda. And ang masakit doon, hindi pa nga tayo fully recovered and fully rehabilitated. But then the collective war memory of the nation is already fading. So kailangan magawa natin ng paraan yan, not to for the people not to forget. Kaya maganda tong mga webinar na ginagawa talaga ng PIVAW about World War II, no, para maisaalala natin kung ano ba yung nangyari nung gera at kung ano yung magandang hindi naman maganda, pero yung mga dapat na aral na na dapat nating gawin to the present, no. So hayon, sana before we even fully recover for it, wag din muna natin kakalimutan. Yun yung as in pinaka-importante.
Actually, that's a very difficult question to answer. No? Have we fully recovered from the Second World War? No? If you look at all the situations that happened after the war, if you take into account all the anniversaries, commemorations that we have celebrated, 100 years na tayo nag-centennial tayo ng Philippine independence and everything. We keep asking that question. World War II is 75 years, ano? 80 years na yata.
Mag-80 na.
Mag-80 years na, no? And the so-called recovery physically, no, with regards to infrastructure and everything, no, these were attempted and these were fulfilled at the time, no, with the help, of course, of the Americans. But you have to, of course, realize of how much the sacrifice that happened with regards to our dignity as Filipinos. Di ba? Sinabi nga nila, naipit tayo dahil walang magawa na hindi tayo ma-develop ang country natin. So the Americans lent us the money in exchange for, all of these historical chapters in our history will always point to the fact that kung hindi daw sinira ng Amerikano ang ating bayan, all of these stories will eventually come out. Now, does this show a full recovery? No? Let me put it this way. As long as we do not have or realize the story of our own country in a proper way, in a very in a history that we can call our own, without the misinterpretations, historical distortions, and everything, it's going to be hard to develop, to be called a developed country. Because if we cannot defend ourselves, even from a simple fact as becoming economically independent, we will have that problem. No? Kaya sinasabi kong mahirap sagutin na kung tayo fully recovered, because one fault that was that happened during the time for the reconstruction after the war still created another problem, still created more problems from that other problem, and will continue so on and so forth, no, until finally, probably, we can have our own history that we can call a nationalistic history. Of course, that will still fall under 1 million tons of semantics. Ano ba talaga nationalist history, no? But the basic importance of realizing, the basic importance of studying our history and culture is one thing. We have to know our identity. We have to know who we are, and everything has to be taught properly for us to realize who we are. No? I'll give an example. It was just like several years ago, no, that someone told me, this is related to the stories of the veterans, no, sa PIVAW. May nagsabi sa akin, ay, kaya naman pinaglaban ng mga veterans yung pinagpatuloy nilang ang mga guerrilla movement dahil daw gusto nila bumalik yung mga Amerikano. I had to clarify that, of course, with the students. So sabi ko sa kanila, kaya lumaban yung mga yan kasi they continued the fight when America already surrendered. These Filipinos continued to fight because they were promised one thing by the Americans. We were supposed to be independent 5 years when the Japanese already were supposed to be independent in 1945. Diba? Ibibigay na sa atin ng independence sa atin dahil sa Commonwealth. Commonwealth was supposed to last for 10 years lang. And the Japanese took that away from us. They took away that hope from us. And that is why we still continue to fight. We didn't want the Americans back. We wanted the Americans back because we wanted them back to give us what they promised us. No? Of course, we can say that in so many ways. No? We can have that or interpret that in so many ways. But then again, we can never call ourselves developed, even after the war, even after the Philippine Revolution, even after anything, if we always fail to know our own identity as Filipinos. Once that is realized, in many of us, probably we can consider ourselves developed after the war. Salamat.
Thank you very much for answering that question. By the way, that was from Sir Eric Albela po. Jeric Albela. Emmanuel. Yes. Thank you very much.
Jeric! Hi, Jeric!
Si Jeric talaga,
Jeric
gagawa
pala
na ko. Kaya pala
Mo naman kami, Jeric eh.
Okay.
Good afternoon po sa lahat. Kamusta po? Pasensya na po sa tanong.
Joke lang, Jeric ah.
Miss you all po. Thank you po.
Salamat din. Salamat sa talong, Jeric.
Thank you very much po. We still have some more questions, but unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I'm sorry for that. But still, thank you very much, Dr. Torres, Ms. Hemera, Ms. Benipayo, and Mr. Candelaria for leading us in this very fruitful and very informative open forum. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in our Q&A portion and for sending in your questions here on Zoom and on our Facebook Live. Thank you very much as well to our research speakers for responding to our viewers' questions. Yes, and to finally conclude this episode of the Kagitingan Historical Webinar Lectures, may we have the Administrator of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, Yusek Ernesto G. Carolina, for his closing remarks.
May I greet Attorney Christine, Rosary Executive Director of the Philippine Commission, Executive Director of the Philippine Commission, Mr. Miguel Angelo Villarreal, Vice President for Corporate Communication and Marketing Services, Philippine Veterans Bank. Of course, I'd like to acknowledge Assistant Secretary Raul Caballes, Deputy Administrator of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, Ms. Desiree Benipayo of the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, Mr. John Lee Candelaria of the Hiroshima University, Dr. Jose Victor Torres, Associate Professor of De La Salle University, Ms. Naomi Hemera of the University of Santo Tomas. I'd like to greet our Zoom participants and all those who are watching in their homes, our Facebook live viewers, and of course, our Juanas. A pleasant day to all. For the 4th episode of our Kagitingan Webinar Lectures series, we have invited 4 esteemed academicians and historians from some of the most prestigious institutions and universities to put together lectures that would discuss the involvement of lesser-known Filipino women in the country's long struggle for independence. This morning, you heard the lectures sa kababaihan ng rebelyong Hukbalahap and the Order of the Poor Clerks in Manila, delivered by Ms. Naomi Hemera and Dr. Jose Victor Torres, respectively. In the afternoon, Mr. John Lee Candelaria led us in the discussion of Dainty Hands Do Useful Work, depicting Filipino women in Japanese wartime propaganda. Meanwhile, we heard Ms. Desiree Benipayo discuss the women of war. As we conclude this year's celebration of the National Women's Month, we deem it necessary that we include these inspiring stories of some of the historical women of resistance in the narrative of women's empowerment. As we do so, we paint our women in a new light, erasing the common misconception that women are docile and weak. Take, for example, the story of Josefa Llanes Escoda, known as the Florence Nightingale of the Philippines. She was a social worker for the Philippine chapter of the American Red Cross and was an advocate of women's right to suffrage, with a Girl Scout training in the United States under her belt. She established the Girl Scouts of the Philippines to train young women to become Girl Scout leaders. She served as the first national executive of the Girl Scouts of the Philippines in 1940. And during the Japanese occupation, she risked her life by smuggling medicines, food, clothing, and even intelligence reports to help the Filipino prisoners and American internees in various concentration camps. She was later caught and imprisoned and was executed. Meanwhile, when tens of thousands of Americans and Filipinos suffered the Bataan Death March in 1942, 3 women in the medical field took it upon themselves to care for and nurse the wounded American and Filipino soldiers and guerrillas. Instead of leaving, when the hospital they were working in was destroyed and burned by Japanese troops, Dr. Gedelia M. Pablan and her nurses, Carmen Lanot and Bruna Calvan, stayed in Bataan and looked for a place where they could continue nursing the wounded. They risked their lives, providing vaccines to malaria-infected guerrillas in the mountains. These women, spirited and determined, were no mere bystanders. They ignored the limits set by their current situation and assumed the role they thought would best benefit their people and defend the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Through the lectures held today, we aim to bring their stories and those of many other female heroes and freedom fighters to the center stage with the earnest hope to motivate our future defenders to emulate the same acts of gallantry and heroism in defending the country. In this connection, I am proud to announce that the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, in close collaboration with the University of the Philippines, has just launched a book titled Identity and Independence, Filipino Women in Times of War and Peace, last March 29, 2022. This book is a tribute to the heroic deeds of Filipino women in times of war and peace. Before I close, allow me to thank the speakers who have led us in this meaningful discussion today. Your insights and guidance have made our Kagitingan Webinar Lecture more purposeful and impactful. We are really excited to hear more from each of you, particularly on the related works that you are currently undertaking. And to all our participants, thank you for joining us in today's webinar episode, Women of Resistance. Let us not forget that the honor of protecting the peace and security of the country does not fall on a specific gender alone. May we embody the heroism and valor of our forefathers regardless of our gender. Let us all stay hungry for knowledge. Who knows? Perhaps in the near future, we might work together with some of you in your research work and produce another book on the many more untold stories about Filipino heroes. Thank you, and join us again in our next episode. Mabuhay ang mga Juana, mabuhay ang mga bayaning Pilipino, mabuhay tayong lahat.
Sec Carolina for that message. Once again, for those who were able to pre-register, we will be sending a link to your email. Kindly accomplish this evaluation form for your certificate of participation. You will receive your e-certificate after a day, and kindly check your spam folder in case it was sent there instead of your inbox. And for all our research speakers, see you all on the awarding ceremony on May 6, 2022. And for the next episode of our Kagitingan Webinar Lectures, here is our schedule. The local history of World War II in the Philippines will be held on April 21, 2022 at 10 a.m. We will be joined by Mr. Jose Matthew P. Luga, Mr. Michael Anihelo Tabuyan, Mr. Jose Alberto L. Jimenez III, Mr. Ruben Jeffrey A. Asuncion, Dr. Marcelino Macapinlac, and Dr. Kirby V. Alvarez. So we hope to see all of you on our next episode. Now, before we officially end our program, may we now have a photo opportunity together with our resource speakers. So we are requesting everyone to turn their cameras on. Starting on our page 1, 2, okay, on the next one, and the last one. Thank you so much. That concludes our today's episode of Kagitingan Historical Webinar Lectures, and we thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you soon in the next one. I am Maria Magagrace E. Sahagun. And I am Felicia Lois Lanya. We have been your hosts for today. Thank you and good afternoon. Mabuhay ang ating magigiting na kababaihan.
Sacrificio